a beautiful day, but I promise there'll be many more. This summer is not over yet. And this is a really important day for the center. So, as I said, I'm glad you're all here. Today we're going to hear two great speakers, Donald Davidson and Joe Freeman, focusing on Indy, the cars of Indianapolis. You saw our great car on display next door. By the way, my name is Glenda Gephardt. I work next door, for those who don't know me. We have all summer been doing these programs, well I should say all summer, all season been doing these programs on America's great tracks. Today is the third installment, and they've all been excellent. Today will be the same, with no doubt. As we were gathering before you came over, we hope you noticed the Mustang on the front lawn. That's our big raffle car this year. And we've all the staff have said it so many times, but just to repeat it one more time, the reason we picked the Mustang is because this is the 50th anniversary of the Mustang concept being debuted at Watkins Glen. And we just thought it was so appropriate to celebrate that significant event by offering the Mustang. So if you haven't purchased your tickets yet, see any of us after the program. The drawing is December 1st, and it's a great car. It's just a great car. Someone's going to be very, very happy when they win. In case you didn't notice, I'm doing JC's announcement here. The one he calls his PBS announcement. So help us support the center, and we'll bring you great things. So, that said, I'll bring Michael Artis here. Michael's on our team and celebrated motorsports author. We still have some of his books. If you haven't finished your collection of Michael's books, we still have some. So, see me about that too. So, Michael.
Thank you all for being here. We really have a wonderful program. Glenda, as the Community Relations Director for the Research Center, does such a wonderful job every year putting together this wonderful series of center conversations. And our two speakers today are on a subject I think near to everybody in America who loves racing. Whether you love dirt track, sports cars, or Formula One, we all love the Indy 500. The Indianapolis 500 is really part of the fabric of our American life, in my view. Perhaps some of you feel the same way. It's years ago, before it was on television, we remember sitting at the earliest years perhaps beside our father, later years on our own, listening to the radio. And then as the years went by, we began to get television coverage. And when you go to this 500 itself, it's a dream for many of us. The pageantry, the tradition. The Indianapolis 500 is truly the world's great race, and it's America's treasure. Our two speakers today, Donald Davidson is our featured speaker, a distinguished historian at the 500. I'm going to speak a little bit more about Donald in a moment when he comes to the podium. But we're first going to hear from a very special guy who has come here today from Boston, Joe Freeman. And you probably were all at the center and saw the beautiful Joe Hunt Magneto Special, which belongs to Joe. Now, Joe owns that car, but he's also a vintage racer. He races that. He tells me he's even tried it on some road tracks where it's a real challenge, but it really excels and runs beautifully on the oval tracks like Milwaukee and Indianapolis and the other places where he has a chance to air it out. Joe runs a multitude of other vintage cars as well. He just came back from Monterey, the famous historic race, Curtis, I think it's about a 1951 or 52 vintage car. He did very, very well out of the field. I think 32 cars, finished fourth, and that's good in any kind of racing. That's better than good. So Joe's quite a guy. He's also the publisher of he is the publisher of Race Maker Press. We're so fortunate to have Joe behind his publishing company. So many wonderful titles come through his publishing company. Joe actually has brought two of them along today. They're displayed here. Afterward, back at the center, might be a unique opportunity to purchase these books, and I'll bet you could get Joe to sign it. These books aren't that easy to find. These are written by dedicated historians. Nobody makes a great deal of money at this, including the publisher. But it's a tremendous contribution to the literature of our sport. It's a tremendous contribution to our sport to have these precious memories maintained in such a handsome format. So consider buying those books. Also, Glenda did such a beautiful job, but I'm going to repeat it since my big brother JC isn't here to say it. I'm going to say, find it in your heart to support the Research Center too. I know many of you do, and there are a lot of ways to do it. We have a sponsorship, an annual sponsorship team that you can join. We have that beautiful Boss 302 Mustang out there, which really harks back to 1962 when we had the first ever appearance of the Mustang. It was the Mustang prototype. As you all know, the Mustang ultimately didn't come out until '64. But in 1962, Watkins Glen at the US Grand Prix was the world debut of the prototype. Sterling Moss was there, just recently recovered from his horrible injuries at Goodwood. And all the Ford brass, Lee Iacocca and Don Fry, and all the engineers were there. It was a very special day for Ford, for the Mustang, and for Watkins Glen. And that relationship with Ford went on for many years. To sort of celebrate that this year, we have this beautiful Boss 302. It's a big part of meeting our budget. As you know, we have no corporate sponsors, we have no governmental assistance. It's all money we raise through our sponsorship team, through the raffle, and through purchasing books. There's the Formula One book at Watkins Glen, which many of you own. It's a book that was done 100% as a benefit for the center, and it's the author happens to be here, and I know he'd sign it for you. So just consider any of those things, and I know most of you do a great deal for the center as it is. Now Joe is an interesting man, and he starts by being an enthusiast. He has all these intellectual capabilities, but it really starts that he's a tremendous enthusiast for the sport. He raced back in the day in Formula Ford, back in the intense days of Formula Ford, really proved his mettle at that. He has segued over the years now into vintage racing, where he's a great supporter. But it goes beyond that. Joe was president of the American Society of Historians. He was also president of the Lars Anderson, I want to say this correctly, the Lars Anderson Auto Museum in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, a very distinguished collection that Joe was president of. And as I said, he was the president of the Society of Automotive Historians. He's a fine writer himself, and it's really a great pleasure to open our program today by bringing Joe to podium. And I think, Joe, you're going to start right there. Is that right?
Thank you very much, Michael. Every big rock concert always has a sort of opener act. And so I'm the opener act, because there's a much bigger act problem. And I thought about, when I'm the opening act, well, what better than to bring the boys the toys? So, this is a collection of cars, many of which won the Indianapolis 500 during a particular era. It was called the Roadster Era. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, I'll try to explain it. During the 30s and early 40s, basically most American championship racing was done on mile and half-mile dirt tracks. Their racing was pretty much a standard setup. The engine was in front of the driver sat, and the drive shaft went underneath his legs, and it was called an upright. The last upright to win the Indianapolis 500 was Troy Wetland in the '98. That's the first car over to your left there. In 1952. Those cars, along with some front drive cars, had pretty much dominated the speedway up until that time. But people were beginning to realize that cars with front drive were not only heavy, they were also difficult to drive at the Speedway. And as a result, they were seeking a better method. They were also seeking to save money by using the car that they ran for the national championship in dirt tracks all over the country to win the Indianapolis 500. And a man by the name of Eddie Kuzma made that 98 car, and that basically Troy Ruttman, who was very young at the time, but a real talent, won the race. But that really was kind of the end of the upright at Indianapolis, because in the next year, two famous designers by the name of Travers and Kuhn, along with another designer by the name of Frank Curtis, got together and decided to design a car with the standard 255 cubic inch Offenhauser engine that I think Don might speak up later, but under any circumstances, a 4-cylinder double overhead camshaft engine that put out about 400 horsepower when it was tuned right and running on alcohol. What's unique about what Frank Curtis did is that instead of having the engine straight up and down in the car with the drive shaft running between the driver, he lowered the whole weight by tilting the engine to the side and putting the driver beside the drive shaft and lowering the weight and the roll center of the car. That was a huge advantage. And in 1952, when Ruttman won, the only reason Ruttman won is because when they brought out Bill Vukovic's, he was the driver, his first driver in Kuhn called fuel injection special. Stu Hilborn had made the fuel injection. Why Vukovic was leading and his steering broke. But he was way ahead, and everybody realized, wow, look at this thing. This is faster than anything we've seen. As a result, it was called a 500A. They made 4 of those cars, and pretty much everybody saw the light and said, wow, these uprights, they're going to be hard to manage. As a result, by the way, that was the origin also of the term Roadster. I want to read from a book that if you don't have it, you should try to get it. It's one of the best books ever written on the sort of technical aspects of the Indianapolis cars by Roger Huntington. It's the design and development of the Indy car. And what he wrote was, so what was so special about this Roadster? What was a Roadster anyway? The trick that distinguished this new Curtis Craft 500A chassis was simply offsetting the drive line approximately 9 inches left of center and positioning the driver's seat to the right and on the drive shaft level. Plus, the engine was tilted 36 degrees to the right to lower its center of gravity. Then, because of the low seating of the driver, the body was more or less up around him. Only the driver's head and shoulders projected out, in contrast to the plastic sprint-type car where the driver sat high and pretty much in the open. Well, from this came a very rapid transition. The evolution was that the upright cars and that initial 500A were what were called rail-frame cars. They were built around 2 major rails. The engine was bolted between, and that was the primary support of the car. There were bars to support the body, but the main frame rails were these 2 large rails. Frank Curtis quickly realized that was not necessarily the best way to go. And he began to modify the 500A and literally produced the 500B, 500C, 500D, all with, interestingly enough, different suspension designs. All of these cars had a certain kind of suspension that's called a 4-bar or a torsion bar suspension, either laterally or across the front of the car. So he was quite successful, and in 1955, Bob Schweikert won the race with a 500C. This is, by the way, Bill Vukovic won in 53, 54. He tried to be killed in an accident, not of his own making, in 55. Bob Schweikert, fantastic driver, won with a 500C in 55. Then a young man by the name of A.J. Watson who had been hanging around Indianapolis and who had made something called the Pots and Pans Special, which is this famous Sicily car that they really threw together out of any metal they could find. Brought it to the Speedway. They had a little trouble with it. It qualified, but it didn't finish the race. A.J. Watson had his own idea about things. Instead of laying the engine on the side, he moved the engine over to the left side of the car. And as a result, in 1956, Pat Flaherty took his first major car, and also A.J. Watson fitted this car together with a space frame. That means tubes welded together. And that became the pattern for all of the Roadsters after that. It was a space frame, tubes welded together to make the frame instead of two big rails down below. Very quickly, other people began to see the advantage of this. By the way, they changed the suspension, and there was innovation at the time. I brought these two. They're both 1955, 1956. They're both 500C and 500D, but the engine is put in a different place than where the winners were. So there was innovation going on at the time. Then an interesting man by the name of George Sally and a friend of his, Quinn Eckerly, got together to work on, for a man by the name of Sandy Ballon, I believe that's proper pronunciation, to produce a truly radical car. That's this car here, the winner in 57 and 58, with Sam Hanks and Jimmy Bryan. That laid the engine absolutely flat in the car. Lowered the weight of gravity. The drive shaft again ran alongside the driver. They had to make some modifications for the offie to be able to do that. But this was a real groundbreaker. But Watson wasn't to be deterred. He went to work for a man by the name of Bob Wilkie, who owned a successful company in Milwaukee called Leader Cards, and he designed basically his standard Roadster for Bob Wilkie. And in 1959, Roger Ward took that to the win. That became really the pattern for the rest of cars from then on. That is in the Roadster era. In 1961, A.J. Foyt won the race in a Watson copy. What's fascinating, Don and I were just discussing before this, Travis just copied that. Absolutely rail for rail from Watson. Watson didn't seem to care. One of the deals that Watson had made with Bob Wilkie was that he would be allowed to make cars for other people, but Floyd Travis, who just made this car, and A.J. Foyt won his first 500 with that. At the same time, they were all driving, this car here I brought, they were all driving dirt cars as well. They were still driving uprights. Again, the majority of the national championship was on dirt tracks like Springfield, Illinois, DuQuoin, the Indy Mile. There were a number. Trenton was actually not dirt, and Milwaukee was not dirt, but they were racing those types of cars. But those were the dirt cars. The Roadsters were really the cars for the pavement. Then Watson continued to build, continued to refine his design. A man by the name of J.C. Agajanian, combined with a superb driver, very aggressive, wonderful man by the name of Parnelli Jones, Rufus Parnelli Jones, and they won the race in 1963, a kind of a controversial race, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I should mention that right now. What happened was that in 1963, a man by the name of Colin Chapman, really I should be back and say Dan Gurney, American racer, had looked at and had seen that the rear engine formula cars over in Europe were really beginning to be, that they had basically swept the field. John Cooper had started the revolution, and it was now a real revolution. This meant that pretty soon somebody was scratched their heads. John Cooper did bring, and I think it was 1962, am I correct? 61. He brought the Cooper over. It was undersized engine, but his driver, Jack Brabham, did well, finished 10th, and pretty much surprised 9th. That's why he's better than I am. Finished 9th with the car, but the car handled beautifully through the corners, and everybody recognized that. And even though there was, well, when at the same time, Dan Gurney put together the Ford Corporation, Cullen Chapman of Lotus, and a great driver by the name of Jimmy Clark, and Dan Gurney, these four, they developed a Ford engine based on a stock block, and a Fairlane, V8, and put together a rear engine racing car which they brought to Indianapolis. They came within a hair's breadth of winning. It was a controversial situation, I don't want to get into now, but he had it made. Carnelli Jones won the race with a Roadster. Jim Clark came back in 1964, but had a lot of trouble with his tires. The tires were being provided primarily by Firestone in these days, although when he came in 64, A.J. Foyt was no fool. He looked at the fact that the tires were wider on the Lotus than his, and he said, I want a set of those tires. They said, no, we need those for the rear engine car. Foyt said, nothing doing. Everybody gets the same stuff. So they had to run out and make a bunch of wider tires, and Foyt won with this car, making the famous statement, I won a hell of a lot of money with this dinosaur, which they were being called at that time. But finally, in 1965, Jim Clark and the Lotus prevailed and basically started the rear engine revolution, and for all intents and purposes wiped out the old Roadsters, these Roadsters. I have an example. This is a Grand Prix car. I do not have a model of the Lotus that Jim Clark brought. I'll get one, but I won't. But the other aspect of this, well, there were obvious advantages. First, you have a much less of a penetration through the air. You could use aerodynamics for downforce. Obviously, the roll center was lower, the driver was laying down, the engine was behind him, the gearbox was behind him, the weight center would be different, and things progressed very rapidly until you had this car, which, for example, Bobby Unser won in 1975, and as you can see, it's radically different from the car, the last Roadster to win in Indianapolis, which was A.J. Foyt's Watson Roadster. Just one other quick comment, and then I want to let Donald take over, because he has a lot more information, is that what's fascinating about all of this, too, is that not only was this all informal, it was a whole bunch of guys in Southern California that were doing this. They were all hot rodders, ex-hot rodders or ex-aviation people, guys who just, they never made enough money out of this. And there was a whole slew of them. I mean, I mentioned Eddie Kuzma, Floyd Trevis, A.J. Watson, a man named Judd Phillips, another man named Luigi Lasowski, the man who made my car, Fat Boy Ray Yelling, who made two cars. They're basically Watsons, exactly the same design, but Ewing was known for his beautiful metalwork. I mean, if you take a look at the car, we're going to see it's a really beautiful piece of machinery. But under any circumstances, this era is beloved. These cars are loved. They had a wonderful sound and a wonderful presence at the Speedway. And for the approximately, really 10 years that they were the primary car in the field in Indianapolis. They were fabulously successful and very interesting, very innovative in their own way, and I can tell you also wonderful fun to drive. Thank you very much.
Joe Freeman has done a wonderful job of setting the stage with his unique perspective on the Roadster Era. Interestingly enough, Donald Davidson, who's about to come to the podium, came first to Indianapolis in 1964, the very year that the Roadster won for the last time. Now, Donald was there as a very young man, who had written to Sid Collins, who was the voice of the 500. And Sid was just fascinated by the knowledge this young Englishman had about the sport. And when he got to the 500, he put Donald on the air, expecting perhaps to have him on for 2 minutes. Well, everyone was in the booth was so fascinated by Donald that I think he was on for 10 minutes, perhaps. They invited him back the next year. He came back as a scheduled guest, was on for a good long time, and after that was offered a job and has been in Indianapolis ever since. Now the story's not quite as simple as that, but it's really a wonderful, wonderful story. Donald is distinguished not only as the historian and such at the Speedway, but such an accessible man. He helps people without question. He's just a wonderful, not only is he such a source, but he's so willing to share. Donald is a distinguished radio commentator. He's also a television commentator. He really has touched all forms of the sport, and he's a much beloved figure in our sport. He's still a young guy, and we're going to bring him to the podium right now.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for that very nice introduction about the fact that I'm still young. I am basically lazy, so I asked if I could just sit down while we're doing this. And the other thing, too, actually, there's all kinds of things to cover here. Can you hear me in the back okay? All right. When Michael first asked me if I would come up and do this and explain what the format was, and they were going to do 4 major racetracks this year, and would I come up and talk about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So my original thought was, which only lasted a few seconds, and that is that, well, then I've got to do a sort of a brief history of the track, and if not 101, then maybe something pretty close to it. And then I immediately thought, you know what? No, I don't need to do that, because the people that would come to this, people that are part of this whole rock and swing movement and the research library and so on and so forth, anybody that's going to come to that, they already know that stuff. Or maybe they don't care, because there's different, so many different forms of motorsport, and there's some people that although I think that everybody that has a basic interest in motorsport, the Indianapolis 500 has come up at some point, or whether they were looking at it from the Jim Clark point of view, or whether they were looking at it from the Cornelius Jones point of view. It's still, everybody sort of kind of has a connection with it. So, anyway, I thought, well, probably it would really be better if I just basically do Q&A. And I've got a number of comments before I get to that point. But rather than just sort of, put my glasses on and read a paper, which I never do, because I do this stuff off the top of my head, but rather than do it from a historical point to begin with, I thought that probably we could do a bunch of history based on the questions that you asked me. So, to just sort of kind of get into the thing a little bit, it's really a kick to be here. It's kind of a pinch me situation to actually be returning to Watkins Glen. I've never been to the research library before, because my years at the Glen far precede the research library. The first time I came up here was in 1972, and the most recent time that I've been here prior to this weekend was 1977. And it came about because of the fact that one of my mentors, a gentleman who I had read, because he wrote some, a great historian by the name of Charles Lytle, and I know he's very, very important to the Argosinger family. And then I think probably that the majority of you are either at least familiar with him, and maybe some of you had interaction with him. But he was an extraordinary gentleman from Sharon, Pennsylvania, and with all due respect to everybody, of all the people that I have met, I felt that he was the best of the historians of the very early days. And although he was American, he was very English in his whole approach. And from the way that he spoke, and the fact that he had a great affection for Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and married a British lady, just he was very, very British in his whole approach. It was just a delightful gentleman. And he was interested in Indianapolis and went back there for years, but his real interest was sort of like the road racing types of the very early days, and he made a number of trips to Europe. I don't know when the first one would be, but certainly late 40s and early to mid 50s, he went to Europe several times, and he would go and visit drivers who had participated. You know, I'm not talking just before World War I. I'm talking the city-to-city races, because he was an expert on, you know, Paris to Madrid and Paris to Amsterdam and all these things. And he would show these photographs, and you know, it would be Vivier or whoever. He had all the pronunciation on all these people that you know, had participated in 1898, you know, and then through the very early 1900s. So just an extraordinary man. But anyway, I had written to him prior to making my first trip to Indianapolis. I wrote to probably a half a dozen people. And one of the questions that I had of him, because I would read the Floyd Kleiner yearbook every year, and there would be sections in the back where there would be these, a little brief story by Charles Lytle, and then these photographs that typically would have 2, 3, 4, 5 people lined up. To this day, I can spot a Lytle print across the room, because there was just you know, they had their own particular stamp on them, and what he did was to take photographs of veterans. And so you look, and it was wonderful to be able to see what these people look like. And so, long before there was a 500 Old Timers Club at the track, because that wasn't formed until 1961, but the Speedway was always a gathering place for all of these people, and they were welcomed with open arms. So if you drove 25 years ago once and finished last, you were welcomed with open arms. And so everybody would come back, and some of them would just come for a few days, others would spend the entire month. They bring scrapbooks, photo albums, and it was just a huge gathering and you know, camaraderie amongst people that had run 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before. And Charles would record all of this on film. And so the fact that I knew of, over, you know, reading the Kleiner yearbooks over a period of 7 years, and coming to realize what a great historian he was, there were several questions that I had about the early days, specifically that some of the early drivers, I didn't know a first name. Maybe just an initial or nothing. And which is sort of very, very European, in that for those of you, and here I am on one of probably a number of tangents that I will do, If after you read, auto car or motorsport or whatever it was, and you go back into the 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s, the drivers went by initials very rarely as a first name appear. So anyway, I was curious as to if you might know who some of these World War I era people were and what the first names were. So this typewritten note came back from the FE Kerr Transit Company, 159 5th Street here in Pennsylvania, and he answered the questions on a number of them. And so I can't say exactly what year that was, but probably 1962. And I was sort of, on my way to eventually making the trip. So I remember when I first arrived at the track, and it's a whole long story, that he was one of the first people that I encountered. And I remember that when I went up and gave my name, he turned around, and he was probably, I don't know, 5'7", and as a friend of mine would describe, round. And he always had 3, 4 cameras hung around his neck, and a little bit of a quick line on that I wasn't even going to tell when it just hit me. But anyway, he wore this white shirt, typically open, never a tie, and several cameras, and he turned around, and when I gave him my name, he sort of turned around and almost stood at attention and said, "Sir, I am very pleased to meet you." And he apparently was taken because of the fact that I was asking about these fellows from the early days. Well, from that point on, he became very important in my life, if he wasn't already, because he started introducing me to a lot of the old timers that were around, and I had been seeing them and coming to know who everybody about what they look like through black and white photographs, and now I was meeting the real people in full color. And so I am kind of making a long story out of this. I'll lighten it up a little bit for those of you that are familiar with Vital, and he would take photographs of all these people and then send them to you. He would either give the person a print when next they saw him, which was probably the next May, or he would send them out as Christmas gifts, and it was just groups of, the Joe Blow standing with, 4 or 5 other old-timers. But, so he had cameras, usually 3 or 4, all, one in front, one down this side, and somebody once asked him, they said, why do you carry so many cameras? And he said, well, this is 4 slides. This is 35 millimeter in black and white. And I can't remember what the third one was, but anyway, the 4th one, he said, now this camera here is for those infernal people that come up and say, would you take my photograph with so-and-so? That one has no film in it anymore. That was just delightful. Well, anyway, to move along a little bit, my first trip to the track was 1964, and it was a 3-week holiday, exploratory visit, and things worked out so well, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. Things worked out so well that I returned the next year, 1965, on a one-way ticket in Greenford, and just flying blind and hoping to land, which I did with the United States Auto Club. A very dear man named Henry Banks hired me to work at USAC. So anyway, that's a whole other story. But Charles Leibel would come and spend the greater part of the month, and so I would spend a lot of time with him. We'd go to dinner and so on and so forth, and he had all these wonderful, wonderful stories. He had the connection with Watkins Glen that goes back to the very, very beginning. And I'm not sure about this, but I think he might have been one of the original 8-10 members of Sports Car Club of America when it was first formed. I mean, he was right in on the ground level. And also involved with Watkins Glen from the very start. And so so anyway, over a period of years, of course, you know the blend history. You don't go from the streets to the course up on top of the hill, and eventually the United States Grand Prix. And he was a part of all of that. And I think his title was Clerk of the Course. And he would say to me every year, because I had an interest in Grand Prix racing. That's basically what I was raised on, except that to me, Grand Prix racing was 250F Maseratis and Lancia Ferraris and Borghinis, and then, rear engine cars came in and screwed the whole thing up, and then I was in Indianapolis as a Roadster. So anyway, Charles Leifer would say, "Come to Watkins Glen," and I thought, 1.5 liter rear engine, tiny little cars, what they don't do dairy power slides like they used to. Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne aren't living anymore, and Castellotti and Musso, and before Argo and Fanshill, it's just all these bricks driving around in these little pedal car looking things. So I'm probably getting a little facetious here, but anyway, so he would say year after year, come to Watkins Glen. Do come, and so finally 1972 was the year that I went up, and so I was up here in 72, 3, 4, and 5, and then not in 76. I had a major conflict where I thought I wasn't even in the country, and then 77 was the finale. But anyway, I came up the first year, and it was the Grand Prix racing had changed quite a bit from what I had fallen in love with. But my golly, to arrive here and get to be involved in really the end of yet another era, because although it had changed dramatically, there were still the privateers. And for those of you, and I know many, I normally wouldn't even get into this, except that I know that so many of you have lived through this yourself. And so you come to Watkins Glen, the little village of Watkins Glen, for the Grand Prix. And so we went to where we were going to get the credentials, and I was thinking that it was a high school, but it's St. Mary's? St. Mary's. All right, and so we drove by that, Michael took me by there last time, the last couple of days, and the building looked familiar, but I was thinking that we had gone down another street a little bit further. But anyway, the point is that we went into this like a gymnasium with a floor just like this, with card tables set around on synchronizing heads. And I think that there was the basketball nets were hanging. And this is where you went to get your credentials. Everybody. And here's Jackie Stewart, all of the, James Hunt, because the 72 was a little early for Hunt, well, anyway, now I'm getting myself in trouble, but I remember that, because I had met Jackie Stewart at the Speedway several years before, so I talked to him a little bit, and then I remember that he was right in front of me, and then he turned around, and then Francois Severa came in, and then stuck a finger in the back of his ribs and just did one of these, and I thought, isn't this amazing that here's this little gymnasium, and the Grand Prix drivers of the world, Lonnie Peterson and X and all these other people are coming here to get their credentials. And so then, of course, the other thing that was just amazing was when you went out to the circuit, and it's the Kendall Tech Center, is up on top of the hill, and the general public are permitted to go down through the middle and out the other side, and all of the teams will land up there. There's no motor coaches, there's no, $500,000 haulers, there's no, you're sequestered away from the general public. There were all these bays, and I don't want this to sound wrong, but it was almost like it was the state fair, and that all of the places where the people would show their livestock. Each one of these bays had a corner around. cars. And it was everybody. It was Ferrari, it was McLaren, it was, I don't know what I did there, but anyway, how did I do that? I didn't touch anything. I had the book fell off. Okay, I heard that. Bob Wilkie's telling me that I'm talking too much. There's a sign. So, anyway, that was just astonishing to me. And I thought, I hope you people that are doing this really appreciate it, because I don't know that it's always going to be like this. I mean, even at that time, I was astounded that it was still like that. So, you know, sure enough, they had the line of people, and that they would go through the tech center, and there's Ferrari, and there's, you know, the stewards, and locals, there's Fittipaldi, and everybody, you know, because they were all there, and sometimes you see the drivers changing clothes. And they're doing the debriefing, and this guy's sitting there in jockey shorts, or with the engineers. And I don't know that if anybody had a computer there, but I mean, there would be, you know, the engineers had the clipboards and there'd be all these discussions going on, and you could watch all of this. And then the other thing, too, that we've been talking about a lot the last few days, was that how did the cars get from the tech center down to the pits, and from the pits back up to the tech center? The mechanics drove them. And then you would hear this engine would fire up, and then here would be the car, either going up the hill at speed or down the hill. And more often than not, there would be one or two other people riding on the car. On the side of the car, there'd be the fellow with the tool chips hanging onto the roll bar. I have no idea what speeds they were doing, but I mean, they had to be 70, 80 miles an hour. And I was very surprised there, I thought, because already I was thinking about liability and so on and so forth, and the people could just sort of stand back at the side of the road, and then 3 or 4 Grand Prix cars would come up with the mechanic, no helmet, you know, massive hair flying around all over the place, and so just so much color. I stayed at the Jefferson, and which was this place with all kinds of character. I know I'm supposed to be talking about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We'll get there. But when I stayed in the motel unit that was out in the back, Charles Michael, you know, made all the arrangements, and I think that I stayed in room number 1. I know it was on the lower level, and I drove by there this morning actually to have a look at the place, because the motel units are still there. All right, then I'll just keep talking. So then the Jefferson was this wonderful old place, and I don't know when that was opened, but it was pre-1900, I think. Was it like maybe 1880s or something?
1840s.
Was it?
1840s.
1840s, okay. Well, so when we were in there, there were no carpets on the floors, and I think that they served food in I think there were 2 or 3 different rooms, if I recall, and a hard floor, no carpets, and they had these French windows. And it really looked like, I mean, you expected the ghost from Blythe Spirit to come in through the window, or Noel Howard to come in. And I mean, you had those people. You had Rob Walker, and everybody, the acoustics were such that every, you know, clink of a plate, or you know, when anybody would get up and they would scrape their chair, and everybody was on top of each other, if you just look around and see all these people. I don't think any drivers stayed there, except I know one year, right above me was Tom Price, and not much is known about Tom Price, except that because he was very, very quiet. Well, not when he was walking around, he wasn't. I never, ever in my life stayed in a room or was ever in any situation with the floor above there was somebody that would literally stamp around. And I mean, this was, you know, over what, 3-4 day period or whatever. Every time he went from A to B, stamp, and all of the fittings would shake and everything. But anyway, let's see, where we so I went to a friend of mine. I don't remember the first time I went to the Glen Motor Court. I notice it's not that anymore, and that's probably I'm going to learn that. It's the Glen Motor Court, at least for some of us. So I don't remember the first time that I was in there for sure, but I know that in 1975, there was a fellow that I knew at a radio station in Indianapolis. He was originally from Cape Cod, that doesn't matter, but he'd been to several different radio stations. A young guy, probably mid-20s, I suppose, and so his radio life brought him to Indianapolis. So he's at 1070 WIBC. I don't think he knew anything about racing, and somebody took him out to the track one day, and there was tire testing going on, and he met Johnny Weatherbrick. And then the next thing, he became a huge racing enthusiast, and he became a Formula One buff. It all happened in a hurry. And for some reason, he hooked on to Nicky Lauda. And Nicky Lauda then was just his god. And so he and his lady friend, who was Kenner's wife, they came up here in 75, and I had come with Charles Lightly because, I guess this is getting a little more personal than I planned, but Charles Lightly, the final year that he came up here was 1975, and he was not able to drive anymore, and it ended up that I was able to repay, years and years of favors by driving from Indianapolis to Sharon, Pennsylvania. I picked him up and then drove him up to Watkins Glen and stayed in the same room with them and basically was his chauffeur, which was equally great because we were allowed to park the car down at the south end of the pits, and Sterling Moss would come by and Chris Amon would come by and all these people looking in the window, and all I had to do was just sit there with Charles. But anyway, we were invited to dinner. And so this friend of mine, Ann Humphreys, and he said, we're going to have dinner at the Glen Motor Court. And I said, good luck getting in there. He said, no, I've checked. If we get there early enough, we can get a good seat. So I don't remember what time we got there, but it was probably like 5 o'clock or 5:30 or something. And the place was, I don't know, maybe half full, but it was beginning to pick up. Well, I don't know how many, I'm sure that probably many of you, if not all, have done the Glen Motor Court experience. And back then it was amazing because a number of the drivers stayed there. And so I remember over in the corner, Carlos Schwedeman and Carlos Pache were right over in the corner, just the two of them, in very deep conversation. And that different people would come in and out. I remember Jody Schechter came in a tennis outfit with a rat, and he came in evidently looking for somebody that wasn't in there, and then he left. And then Regazzoni comes in with a black leather jacket with the collar turned up, and which reminds me of another thing I was going to go back and tell you from 1972. But he came in, almost looking. It was almost a very, very nice guy, but he had a little bit of a menacing look about him. And the black jacket, the collar turned up, hands in his pockets, and he looked like he was looking for a fight. Well, I mean, he was a really nice guy, but I remember that. So there was a table that was vacant next to us, and here's my friend Nat, and we're looking at all these people coming in and out, and then all of a sudden he says, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, the world champion just came in. And we looked up, and here's Nicky Lauda, who just arrived, with another guy with him. That was Heinz Kula, who was an author. I don't know if anybody knows that name. He wrote the Ring book, and I think he did maybe a couple books with Lauda. And so, anyway, Nat is just completely goes to pieces. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. He's in here. I'm in the same room with Lauda. Well, it got better because this vacant table Lauda and Heinz Kohler sat right next to us. And Charles was so amused because to him, you know, the great drivers were George Boileau and Christian Lautenschlager. You know, anybody that's sort of come along in the 40s and 50s and 60s, you know, he didn't take us seriously. And, you know, Nicky Lauder was sort of just like the latest flavor of the month that was going to be gone in no time. And then, you know, but anyway, so he was needling that. And I bring this up because for any of you who may have gone in, are there people in fact that went into the Glen Motor Court in the 70s? All right, I don't know if this is still there or not, but right under where he was sitting, there was a painting. If anybody remember this, it's Nicky Lauda in a Ferrari, and I think there might have been one other car. But instead of a racetrack, it was sort of like on the beach in faded light with the time coming in. Does anybody remember that? It was the Ferrari with the, I don't know what this guy was thinking of, but it was actually it was an action shot. So it looked like a Michael Turner, but it wasn't a Michael Turner, and he's flashing through this water. And so Lauda was talking to Heinz Kohler, and at one point he sort of looks up at this thing and goes, and then I was able to say, why are you driving in the sea? And so I don't remember what the response was, but anyway, it just made Nat stay, and I don't know why I brought this up other than that I'm just a horrendous name dropper, and I hope you don't mind. In talking about Regazzoni, the first year that I came out here, and it was great because Charles took me to all these places. I mean, I had access to everything. And it was the Onyx Club at the time, and they had a champagne party there. It was the last year. They had done this for several years, but because of financial considerations, it ended up that I made it to the last one that they had. And they would invite a lot of participants to go to this thing. I mean, it was very, very in. And the Onyx Club, to me, it was sort of, it was like going to a ski lodge. And you know, it was the first week in October, so it would get dark at like 5:30, and it would be pitch black by 7. And so here's everybody going to this party. And I remember Ron Taranak was there, and Sam Posey, and on and on and on. Anyway, the Ferrari team were detained because they were having a debriefing. And I'll never forget this. I just happened to be standing by the door. The door was open, and it was a little bit nippy. You know, it would get frosty up here. And so the party is now in full swing. And here came the 3 Ferrari drivers, and I'll never forget this. It was Jackie Ickx, Regazzoni, and Mario with a Ferrari team. And they arrived from their debriefing. They still had the uniform on, and then the red Ferrari Firestone jackets, and with the collars turned up. And they stood there, and you know, when Mario entered the room, not the tallest guy that there's ever been, but he had a presence about him. And I've been in several situations where Mario comes in and everything stops. And there's no punchline to this except that when he would come into a room as he did that night, and he would stand there, and it reminded me of Jack Palance in Sheen. Although Mario didn't pack pistols, he would stand there and just kind of go, and Regazzoni, they would just come into the room and kind of stand like this. With the collars turned up. Anyway, I'll never forget that. So, just these little images. I am going to move on, but I'll give you a couple more images that, one that was just given to me by the son of a famous name, Wilbur Shaw. had a son, Bill Shaw, and I don't know if any of you may have ever had a connection with him. He's actually Warren Wilbur Shaw Jr. He's just a delightful person, and he did race for a while. He was awfully close to going to Le Mans in sometime in the early 70s. He was an instructor for Bob Bondurant for several years, so some of you may have run into him there. But anyway, he's lived in the Indianapolis area for quite a number of years now. And so I told him, or he either knew I was coming up here, or I told him that I was coming up about a week ago. And he said, wow, the Glen. I said, did you ever run up there? And he said, no. But he said, I actually went there once. And he said, I went with a student of mine who was going to run in an SCCA regional. And he said, he was working in Washington at the time. And he said, I went in there, and even though it was a regional meet, he said, I started getting images of what had gone before. And he said, I had these flashes of Brabham and Stewart and Clark. And he said, I'd never been there before, but he said, it was really kind of overwhelming. He said, I could hear the sounds, smell the smells, and he said, I got goosebumps thinking about it. He said, I got goosebumps then, and I got goosebumps now, just talking about it. This was just like a week ago. And I said, I think I know exactly what you mean. And he kept saying, wow, wow. So, and when this was, I have no idea, but I mean, that might have been 30 years ago. So, the place has this wonderful presence. I got a little Glen story to tell here, and I as you probably already gathered, if you didn't already know, I talk a lot. Not only am I a name dropper, but I talk a lot. And when I get with a group like this, I kind of want to be able to talk freely. And I'm looking at a little red light over here. I'm looking at a tripod with a piece of equipment on top of it with a red light. And I think, you better be careful here, because sometimes I maybe express an opinion here or there when the Q&A gets a little passionate. And some of the opinions expressed herein may not necessarily be those of the management. Anyway, a Glen story, and I don't know if this is true or not, and I would do nothing to be a negative about the place, but I do remember the smoke in 1974 rising from an infamous area that probably the locals would rather not talk about. I get asked about the state here at the racetrack all the time, and I know that the locals up here would just as soon not acknowledge that there had ever been the bog. But anyway, the reason for bringing that up was that the first year that I was up here, it rained a lot. And I was impressed by how large the crowd was, but also the makeup. I mean, you would hear the foreign accents, and so obviously there were people that had come from overseas, and then you had the people that were from overseas that lived here. But then also there seemed to be a lot of college types. And I saw fatigue jackets, I saw long hair, and I saw a number of couples where the male and the female were joined by a piece of twine or rope. Does anybody remember that? I'm not making it up. And you'd see the guy would have a wine bottle, and there would be like a piece of twine around his wrist, and that the lady friend, who was also wearing denim and fatigues, would be, a few feet further behind. Anybody, I mean, I'm not making that up. Anybody remember those days, or you just put it out of your mind? So, there was this apparent story, which I think was probably 73, 74. And I mean, I didn't read this on Wikipedia or get it on a blog years later. I remember at the time, the story was that there was a well-to-do person involved with a team. They weren't a team member, but they they were sort of like a gopher. They were a stooge and eager to do anything that needed to be done. So one of the teams needed something that the fellow said, I can get it, and he went down to the village, and it's at night. So he went down to the village in his very expensive automobile, and when he comes back, he got lost. And he's at the circuit, but he couldn't find his way to the Candletech Center. And he's driving around, and he's driving around, and he gets over into the dock area with all the thousands of pop tents and everything. And so he's going down this little road, and everybody's sort of kind of just freely walking back and forth. You know, the bonfires are going, and the parties are in full swing. And his progress is being impeded with the rolling period. Finally gets to the point where he stops. And so they start making a big fuss of this car, and they're banging on the roof, and then they start rocking the car. And the guy panics and thinks, I better get out of here. So he gets on the throttle, and as he takes off, he feels a bump. And he thinks, oh my God, I think I'm running over one of them. So he keeps going, and he thought, well, I have to report this to the police. So he drove around to wherever the police were, and it seems to me that there was like a little, I'm looking for Michael, and I think Michael probably thought, he's telling that story, I'm out of here. So I don't see Michael at the moment, but there was this little cinder block building with, you know, piece of wire with a you know, naked light bulb hanging there, and so the guy comes back, sees this building, goes in there, and there's like 3 policemen sitting in there, and so he said, I want to report something. He said, I think I ran over somebody, and so they don't move particularly, and they said, well, you know, where was this, sir? Well, it was over in the back where all of the, you know, where all the pop cans are. And they said, well, did you get a look at the person? And he said, well, no, because everybody looked the same. They're all in denim and petite jackets, but I really think that I ran over one of them. And so they said, don't worry about it. You know, we'll find it in the morning. I don't know if that's true or not, but I probably shouldn't have told that story. All right. We need to be talking about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We didn't get into that yet. So what I would propose to do here now is we'll do general Q&A. I don't think really any explorative. I mean, there's all kinds of things I can tell about the Speedway, but I think you either already know it or you don't care, and maybe the specific things that you'd like to be talking about. And so if you're not entirely familiar with what I do, I'm very fortunate in that I have this. I know I've worked for the United States for a couple of years, but then it ended up that I went to work for the track. I actually became a historian in 1998, and so the title is Historian of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We think that, well, let's put it this way. Nobody that I've talked to, we do not believe that there is another racetrack in the world that has a historian that's on a full-time staff. And most tracks will have a historian, but it's either a part-time situation or a donation of time, but I'm actually on the payroll, and we think it's the only one. And it's a full-time job, believe me. So anyway, I'm a historian by nature as well as by vocation, and I've just been very blessed. I'm not a gearhead. I have no mechanical knowledge at all. When I tell people when I get ready to do the Q&A, I'm really not into controversy, and I'm sure that there's a number of the questions that you have will be of a, will, you know, require going into a controversial area, which I just as soon not do, but I also, you know, won't duck out of fairness to, you know, out of respect to you, you know, wanting to get my opinion on something. Anyway, I'm not the gearhead. I memorized a bunch of stuff parrot fashion. So if you have a question of a technical nature, I can probably give you a halfway decent answer. I memorized it parrot fashion. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about when I'm giving you the answer. I'm really about the people. I've been blessed to meet a lot and you know, go to some of the homes and get to know the families and so on and so forth. So I guess just basically, you know, just whatever you would like to talk about. And, you know, I hope I didn't offend anybody with some of my walk-in squint toys, but yes, sir.
I just noticed that a friend of mine sitting on the other side of the stadium, and he's a cousin, nephew, or something of Andy Granatelli. Do you have any good Andy Granatelli children?
What was the connection with Andy Granatelli?
I believe there's Angelo on the other side is the nephew, cousin.
Oh, he is a Granatelli.
No.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say that whether you are a relative or not will depend on how I answer this.
I don't think so.
Andy Granatelli is just an extraordinary person. I think probably the greatest showman, certainly the greatest showman of the 60s and 70s, probably the greatest showman ever. And he's just an extraordinary person in that, because of his size for much of his life, that he is still operated. Because I remember when he had the Rex turbines, do I want to talk about the Rex turbines? Not particularly, but when he had the Rex turbines and he would be running up and down, and I think he was probably 48 at the time, and I thought, you know, that guy's never going to see 50. Well, next March, he's going to be 90. It's amazing. I think it's March 17th or something. He's going to be 90 years old. And he has difficulty getting around, but that's been true for many, many years. But he is as sharp as a tack. He has a really strong, deep voice. He talks 100 miles an hour. I mean, he trips over himself because his brain is working so fast. And I mean, the guy is just a genius. And where can we go here? An innovator, although I think that he would like for you to believe that many of the ideas were his own. But I think that what he did was, and some of them probably were his own, but I think he also surrounded himself with people who were knowledgeable and had ideas, and he was able to promote and put into reality what other people had thought might work. He did drive, and and I do have to be kind of careful because this is being recorded, and he may even get a copy of this. I don't know, but he did actually drive at the Speedway and made a qualifying attempt in 1948. And the trivia about that is that if you now, I guess I already gave you the punchline, but the number of drivers of these kind of cars, by the way, is dwindling. And so there's a few facts here. How many drivers are there living who drove in the Indianapolis 500 in the 1950s? And the answer is 5. How many in the 40s? None. When Jim Rathman passed away, he drove with his debut was 49. So when Jim Rathman passed away, right before Thanksgiving last year, that was the last of the 40s drivers. And so now we have the earliest start for anyone who's still living is 1955. There's 2 drivers, Chuck Wyant and Eddie Russo from 1955, and then there's Don Edmonds from 57, and then A.J. Foyt and Paul Goldsmith from 58. Those are the only 1950s guys left. Anyway, having said that, the earlier start that you'll find of anybody who's alive is 55. What is the earliest year for anyone who's still alive that made a qualifying attempt, and the answer is Andy Granatelli. Because he made a qualifying attempt in 1948. He is not the oldest driver who drove on the track. There's a guy named Frank Barini, who was a midget car driver who actually was at the Speedway in 1949, and he took part of the rookie test, and I think he just turned like 97, 98. He's right up there, but anyway, so I digress. But Andy Granatelli first came to the track in 1946, and he and his brothers had a company called Granker, and which was actually made up of Granatelli Corporation, and they were hot rodders. They were on north side of Chicago, and they not only did they hot cars, but they also had products. You could buy Granker products. And then they became car entrants at the Speedway. They had an association called the Hurricane Hot Rod Association, which ran track roadsters, not these, but like the 32 Fords and so on and so forth. And so when you use the term roadster, you actually have to distinguish which you mean. There's track roadsters, there's these roadsters, which is a complete misnomer because those were built for tracks. And the term actually refers, as Joe explained, really just to the Bukovich car was just the roadster. And my personal preference was the tangent off of the tangent off of the tangent. You see the term roadster all the time with a capital R. My personal preference is lowercase r and whole cars because it's a nickname. But anyway, track roadsters was a huge movement on the West Coast in right after the war. And there were numerous great stars of the 50s and the 60s that came out of the West Coast track roadsters. And some of them actually, migrated to the Chicago area to be part of the Granatelli Hurricane Hot Rod Association. And just to give you an idea of track roadster drivers, I mean, we're talking Jack Graff, Manny Leo, Troy Ruttman, Dick and Jim Rathman, Pat Flaherty, A.J. Watson as a mechanic. All these guys knew each other. Bob Schweikert was from Northern California, but he came down as part of it. The infamous Ed Elysian, Don Freeland, Andy Linden, Dempsey Wilson, Bob Scott, Jimmy Davies, and you can go on and on and on and on. Well, anyway, several of those fellows went to the Chicago area. Dick and Jim Rathman and Pat Flaherty, and another guy named Chuck Layton, Satan Layton. They all went to become a part of the Granatelli Hurricane Hot Rod Association, and then later that became the Hurricane Racing Association. Granatelli engine cars at the Speedway, I mean, they started out with stock block engines, flanker Fords, which were, they used Mercuries with these flanker heads. And then starting in he ended an Offie in 48, which didn't make it, but from the time you get from 50 on, they were often powered Curtis Susan, he had an Pat Flaherty drove for him, Fred Evasion, and then Jim Rathman got a second in 52. And in 54, all of a sudden, he just upped and quit for the time being, and sold Granker and was out of racing. He moved to California, and then suddenly he's back in the news again in very early 61, when Lou Welsh, who owned the Novice, was having a battle with the government, and then all of a sudden the Novice team was available for a song, and so Granatelli purchased the Novice and entered one in 61. It got there late, and they just entered the one car. Probably this could go on forever, but they were back in 62 with 2 cars. They didn't make it again, but then in 63 with 3 cars, they did something that Lou Welsh had never done. They had 3 Novices in the field. And it was Jim Rathman, Bobby Unser, the drag racer, Art Malone. And then in 1966, there was one of the oddest groupings, I think, in the history of motorsports was that the STP Corporation sponsored the Lotus team. And then you had Colin Chapman, Dave Niven, and Jim Clark paired with Granatelli. And when that happened, I remember thinking, boy, I don't know how long this is going to last. Granatelli and Chapman and Clark. Well, actually, they were together for, they entered into actually a fourth season, except of course Clark was no longer around, but they did the Lotuses in 66 with Clark and Al Unser, and then in 67 it was Clark and William Hill, and then the Wedge turbines came on the scene in 68 with 4. Everybody thinks there were 3 of those cars, there were 4. And then in the meantime, now I really am galloping, Al Dean had passed away. Dean Van Lines passed away after the 67 season was over, and his will required that the Dean Van Lines team be disassembled, and so then it became the Andretti racing team. There were several teams, if you look, like in 67 and 68, you had the John Cobb racing team, the Andretti racing team, they were all tire dealers. How much money did the principal have in it? None. All the teams were Firestone and Goodyear. Well, anyway, so Andretti did his own thing for 68. And then for 69, there was a marriage made between Granatelli and Andretti. But more than that, and I guess I just random thoughts here, this is one of the biggest surprises, I think, ever. Because, and many of you probably remember this team, on paper, the Lotus 64, rear-engine Lotuses, four-wheel drive, turbocharged Ford, Mario Andretti, Graham Hill, Joachim Rindt, the front row, right? No! They missed the show! Those cars never turned into a race. Mario had a huge accident in practice, and that car was withdrawn, and then the other two that Chapman had, because Clint Warner and Jimmy McGee had the Mario car pretty much, and then Joachim Rindt and Graham Hill, they were withdrawn. And then Hill ended up doing TV commentary for Closed Circuit TV, or ABC, I think it was. But anyway, so then Granatelli had moved on, and he was on his way to leading the STP Corporation, which he did, I think he through 74, I think is when that ended. And then so then he was pretty much ousted as a car owner. His son Vince came back in, but Andy still had a presence, and he put STP on the map. I mean, it wasn't a new product. It was always there was a series of business deals that were made in the early 60s involving, and some of you probably need to know the story. So Studebaker, Paxton Products, McCulloch Engineering, and all these different companies came together, and Andy was working for Studebaker, and they had this product and said, why don't you see if you could sell this? And it was STP, which stood for Scientifically Treated Petroleum, and I think it was a German had invented this, so like in the late 40s or something, and it had been around for a while, and they said, why don't you see if you can, sell this? Well, by golly, he did it. And then, but Studebaker had not stopped yet, and so they took some Studebakers from Bonneville with Paula Murphy and Barbara Nyland, and there was a couple of other ladies. I know Paula Murphy, I came to know her very, very well. Anyway, let's see. I guess I'll wind up here by saying that there were a lot of people that didn't care to have Granatelli around. I mean, I know that he was a thorn in a lot of people's side, but he did wonders for motorsport, because even with the wedge turbines, when they went to Milwaukee and they went to Trenton, they had the biggest cars they've ever had. And I remember thinking at the time, well, I personally, and here I go with an opinion, I mean, personally, I never liked the turbines. Boo. But I realized maybe either at the time or very shortly thereafter that those cars brought in the general public, a lot of curiosity seekers. And maybe that some of them, they came once and saw the turbos and never came back. Or it may have cultivated some race fans that otherwise wouldn't have been. So, I mean, I think that his contributions were pretty significant. All right, yes, sir.
Staying on the roadster thing,
Yes.
who qualified from
Okay.
Speedway? What year was that? And if you know what that qualifying speed was, what you actually run out of that car at the end? And if you actually had an interest in really want that driver.
All right, his question was about roadsters, and when was the last one, and what was the qualifying speed, and so on and so forth. The last time that Watson, the last time that I Watson with a normally aspirated Offie, with a 255 on supercharged, there were 4 of those in the 1965 race. In 1966 was the last Watson Roadster, and Bobby Grinn qualified for the last row, and that was a Watson Roadster with a turbo Offie. Unfortunately, it didn't get very far. There was an accident right at the start that took out 11 cars. That's the one that there were no injuries. It's not the bad one you're thinking about. The only injury was Foyt, who decided that it would be better if he was on the other side of the fence, and he scaled the fence like King Kong going up the Empire State Building. And as he went over the fence and then dropped down the other side, he actually cut his thumb. That was the only injury. Anyway, Gurney was taken out of that, and Cale Yarborough. I mean, there was some really good cars taken out of that accident. And unfortunately, the Roadster, the Bobby Grinn Roadster, got caught up in that. All right, in '67, Hurtubise showed up, and they had 2 cars. And I asked somebody one time, Donald Shepard was a mechanic. He said, actually, there were 2.5 of those cars. They never finished with the third one, but there were 2 at the track in '67. And Hurtubise drove the one himself, and then Ed Rose from Houston, Texas, had the other one, which he crashed on the morning of the first qualifying day in the hot lap session. Before the days where they divided them down into 2 groups, so you could get 50 cars out there all hot lapping at the same time. Anyway, so the reason that I mentioned that one is because it comes back into the picture a little bit later. Hurtubise qualified this and got bumped and was the second alternate starter. And then he came back the next year with it slightly modified and re-qualified. And that's the answer to your question. 1968 was the last time that a front engine car qualified for the race. It was Hurtubise with they called the cars the Mallard. First of it was the Pepsi Cola Frito-Lay Special. He burned a piston, I think, after 9 laps and came in, and when the car was pushed through the gate to go back to the garage area, that's the last time that a front engine car was ever in competition at the Speedway. And so, if you want a story about Hurtubise, I think I know where you're going with this, and I'd rather not. I'll just say that Hurtubise is a very interesting character, and I hope no family member would take it wrong. Kind of a sad character because he is remembered for his antics in the later years of his career, and maybe getting sideways with the officials and trying to fight City Hall and losing. And it's a great shame that that's what he's remembered for, because in the early 60s, he was very much of a contender. From North Tonawanda, which is not that far from here, and he came back, he and Parnell Jones came back together, and he set 1 and 4 lap track records as a rookie on the last qualifying day of 1960 with the Travel-On Trailer Special, which was a rebuilt car, which again shows how things have changed a little bit. That's the car in which Ed Elysian lost his life. The car got upside down, and so what did you do in those days when you had a fatality? Well, you repaired the car and got another driver. And so, anyway, Hurtubise did 1 and 4 lap track records, but he was in the back because he didn't qualify on the first day. And front row with the Daimler Special, which is also just up at the Daimler was a cider manufacturer from Niagara Falls. And then Hurtubise led the race for that and dropped out. And in '63, they would jump 2 years. He drove the Novi, middle of the front row, led the first lap, great battle with Carnegie Jones. He won 4 national championship races, and he won a number of sprint car races. And then when he had this terrible accident, but right after the '64 500, he had terrible luck at Indianapolis. And in '64, he dropped out running 3rd. They then went to Milwaukee the next week, and he was running nose to tail in 3rd place with Roger Moore leading, who'd been runner-up at Indianapolis. Second was Foyt, driving the '64 winner, was running 2nd, and then Hurtubise was right behind him with a roadster that he and his brother Pete had built up in a barn in North Tonawanda. And they were running literally nose to tail, and Ward had a transmission failure, and Foyt couldn't get back up in time. I mean, he got on the brakes, but Hurtubise ran up over his wheel, hit the wall, and then there was metal fire, and then Hurtubise was horribly burned, and so he was shipped to the San Antonio Burn Center, but within 3 months he was out of the hospital, and then, famously, forgive me ladies if you don't know this story, it might upset a few people, but he had these very badly burned hands. And the doctor came in and said, all right, we're going to do an operation on your hands. And I want you to think about this for a few days. We are going to set your fingers. And however we set them, that's how they're going to be. And he said, can you curl them so I can grab a steering wheel? Well, I guess the doctor about fainted when he heard that, but Hurtubise was perfectly serious about that. And indeed, by the following spring, he was back running race cars again. And I kind of have a reason for getting into this, was he ran through the '65 season in great pain, and he'd have the hands would be bandaged, and they would bleed and everything, but he was so determined to race. And then in March of '66, at a time when NASCAR was big, but it wasn't getting the national or international attention, and Hurtubise went down there and he won the '66 Atlanta 500 with Lorenzen running and Richard Petty and David Pearson and all of the top guns, and Hurtubise won the Atlanta 500, and nobody ever hears about that. So anyway, he did not like rear-engine cars, although he drove them in several races, and he still, in the beginning, believed, as did others. John Branson didn't like rear-engine cars either, and there were several people that still thought, going into the 67, 68, 69 time, that a lightweight front-engine car could still do the job. And so Hurtubise would struggle with the thing, and I know that, again, I'm almost done with this one, the popular memory of Hurtubise is just antics and fooling around with a front-engine car on the last day with no hope of making it. And but in 67 and 68 and 69 and 70, he was dead serious. I mean, he was talking about qualifying for the front row in 68, but, it just, time had passed them by, or I mean, if they'd had better engineers, it was just typical. I'm going to actually go back to pick up something that I think that either Joe or Michael made a comment. It was Joe about just a general comment, because I was getting a little heavy there. But in '64, my first year at the track, and if you look back in the years before that and the years later, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was this wonderful gathering of all these enthusiasts, and I don't just mean enthusiasts only, but enthusiasts with the wherewithal. And it seemed to me that there were other parts of the country where, whether you want to call them specialists or they had tunnel vision or whatever it was, but I mean, typically you tended to find it, and don't take offense, but it seems to me that on the East Coast, you were either you were a midget guy, or you were a sprint guy, or you were a stock car guy. You were doing the heavies, and usually that's what you stayed with. There weren't very many people that either went from one to the other. And I mean, you can prove me wrong, because I know there are exceptions, but for the most part, and even in the Midwest, but it seemed to be that on the West Coast, there was all of this diversity, and everybody was into everything. And but I'm talking about hot rods, drag racing, motorcycle racing, and sports car racing. And a lot of the West Coast people, Saturday night, they would be at Ascot Park at a sprint race. And then the next day, they'd be at Riverside for a sports car race. Or it would be stock cars on a road course. And these guys would come back to Indianapolis. And if you look, if you either see the films, or you can look at the photographs of the qualifying shots from the 60s and the 50s, and you look in the background and see who's on the crews, it was unbelievable. Because you had, D. Jeffries, the painter, was on Parnelli's crew, and also he worked with Foyt a little bit. But you had I could just go on with the name of Gurney. Even when you're into rear engine cars, Gurney had Calvin Rayburn and Chuck and Larry Palmgren and Mert Lawwell. I mean, these are bike racers that were at the top of their profession, but they all went back to Indianapolis. I mean, Don Prudhomme was never on a crew, but I'd see him in the garage area every year. He would come around and be looking at, normally it was stock block engines, but everybody was interested and involved with everybody else. It was just a marvelous time. Now everybody is a specialist, and because these guys are volunteers. I mean, now everybody on the team has a 401k and travel expenses and everything. They used to travel in station wagons and live together. And we were I was talking to Joe earlier about the fact that typically, not this, but this wasn't the exact point, but still, in early 60s and into the mid-60s, there were a number of teams where you had one paid employee on the team, and it was the chief mechanic. And he was everything. He was the aerodynamicist, he was the engine man, and he was also the team manager. Some car owners were very, very much hands-on. There were other car owners that were strictly sportsmen. They wore a suit and a tie, and they owned yachts and race horses, and they owned a race car. If you lifted the hood, they wouldn't know what was underneath it. There were several like that, and it was funny how, I'm on a roll now, the chief mechanics, I don't know how many chief mechanics would refer to it as my car. That was my car. Well, it really wasn't actually, it was Mr. So-and-so's car. It was my car. And the car owner was the guy with the suit and the hat and the tie that would come around every now and again and wasn't particularly welcome in his own garage because, if we need money, we'll call you. And, but anyway, so you had the one guy that was the chief mechanic, and he would tow the car, and everybody else would be volunteer. And they would either meet, at Indianapolis, because that's where a lot of teams were based, and then they'd cram into the station wagon, and then they would all drive together, or a lot of people, you would pick up the crew at the track. When Jim Rathman won the race in you don't have that one, do you? When Jim Rathman won the race in 1960, the only employee was Chicky Hiroshima, who was the chief mechanic. You may have read that it was Smokey Unit. It wasn't. Smokey was brought in to supervise the pit stops. He was not the chief mechanic. But the point is, when they came to the track, they didn't have a crew. They picked one up for race day, and several of the people that worked on the winning crew were on cars that had missed the show. So Bruce Flower was the chief mechanic for a Chevy, which hadn't made it, and I think he did the left front. I think there's a photograph of him actually doing something with well, anyway, he's in the shops. Al Keller, maybe somebody remembers that name, was a driver, was a sprint car driver, drove in the 500, and he also won some NASCAR races when they would be 100 backwards on a quarter-mile dirt, paying 1,000 to win, or less. Anyway, Al Keller was Bruce Power's driver, and he'd been in the race in 55, 56, 57, 58, and 59, and then they missed it in 60, so I think he was on the right front. Now, when's the last time you had a driver miss the show, and then they get a job as a volunteer on a pit crew? Been a while. But anyway, the point with Joe, which I said I was going to mention probably 15 minutes ago, was the fact that I talked with A.J. Watson quite a bit just recently, and he was telling me about the people that would come over to his shop in Glendale to help build the cars on a volunteer basis. And I think, boy, how times have changed. He said, there was one guy, he said, we had a guy named Dallas Roy, and we paid him $75 a week. But he had like several of his friends, Larry Shinoda, Shinoda, and there was a guy named Leroy Kane. I'm stuck on some of the other guys now. At one time, he had 5 guys on his crew, all with the first name George, and they had nicknames. There was Flat Out George, there was Hollywood George, and then there was a guy that had a really strange personality, and he was Miserable George. I can't remember what Miserable George's name was, but anyway, Watson said that these guys, he said, we never built any cars in Indianapolis. He said, everything we ever built was in Glendale. But he said they guys would come over after work and help put the cars together. So they volunteered to build cars that they were going to go back to Indianapolis and volunteer to be on a crew just to be part of it. And then if they finished first, second, or third, maybe they gave them, a couple $100 or maybe nothing. I don't know. But anyway, they were just unbelievable days, and I didn't mean to run on so much here. All right, this gentleman.
There was a driver who most of us in this room, I think, revered quite a bit. He was a great sports car driver in the late 50s and early 60s, Walt Hanscom. Could you just elaborate for some of the people that may not understand his Indianapolis career in 64 and 65?
Yeah, absolutely. The gentleman asked about Walt Hanscom, and I remember that when Michael first called me and said, he said, I'm going to do a book on the history of Walt Hanscom. I said, whoa, that's a pretty specialized subject, because he was sort of revered within those circles. But I think that a lot of people, even at the time he was running, when he showed up at the Speedway, a lot of people didn't know who he was. Well, he was 44 when he came to Indianapolis in '64, which at that time was the oldest so-called rookie. The first time I think I was aware of Walt Hanscom was that he won in 1959, 58 or 59, had to be 58, at Silverstone. He won the production car race before the Grand Prix with a Jaguar Mark 7, I think it was. And I think that's probably the first time that I was aware of him. I might have known about him before that, because I would read Autosport, and I'm dating myself here, but circa 56, 57, and there was a lady named Ruth Sands Bentley used to write the report, so I'm sure that I saw these names several times. But to kind of just do a nutshell on this, he was Mark Donahue's mentor. And so how he got connected with Indianapolis, I really don't know. I did meet him very briefly, and he was quite tall. I think he was about 6'1", maybe. He was tall, and then also I was surprised that he had a very high voice. It was sort of like a high sing-song voice. And anyway, so he was part of the Shell Qua Valley. And good luck spelling that, except it's slightly easier than Roman Slobodinsky. When I get people, when I had people, and I thought about that with the 75 Winnetou, when somebody told a story about designs, I said, okay, well, when you're spelling Slobodinsky, if you don't end up with a J, you got it wrong. So anyway, so Shal Qualali, and he was the, I think he was like a BMC dealer up in San Francisco. And so how that team came about, I have no idea, because it was an interesting bunch. Peter DiPaolo was the team manager, and A.J. Foyt was in the mix to drive one of the cars. And so there were three of them the first year, and it was Pedro Rodriguez and Walt Henskin and then maybe Foyt. And Foyt actually tested the one which had number 1 on it. He tested it, I think, in either like late March, early April, and then it was injured, and then he drove it in May, but I think only for 1 day, and then got out of it. So I think he'd already decided probably in the spring, I'm going to drive this. But he did take it out one more time, and then it became Bob White, car number 54. Pedro Rodriguez had a shunt with his, and so he was out, and so was the car, because we didn't do no backups in those days. There may be another car to drive, but it wouldn't have the same number in it. So anyway, then Walt Hanscom had the car that was blue, number 53. And so the thing about both of those drivers is, I'd say Bob White had his finest run. He had a long career at the Speedway. He had 11 starts. And he was a very steady driver who normally, he was jacked the very first couple of years, but from that point on, he was very much of an enduro driver, and then maybe to some people thinking, well, he's a coast and collect. But he figured, look, if I just sit out here and run all day and cars drop out and I stay in the hunt and I can finish 7th and make a buck, that's good, isn't it? So, but I mean, who knows? Maybe he was running 110, well, you can't run 110%, you can run 100%. But anyway, be that as it may, he did get up to 3rd at one point, and then dropped out. Having said that about Vice, golly, here I am on. This is a problem for me. I don't do a very good job of editing, and because I know that you're all enthusiasts, I want to throw out all of these little weedy bits, and I'm going to do a slight tangent and say that when they went back to Monza for the second time in 1958, and the surprise of surprises was that Luigi Musso with a Ferrari won the pole, and Phil Hill says that the engine in that car was out of the Portago's record, the Mila Mila. Did anybody know that? Yeah, okay then. And again, that shows you how different things were. We did an engine for this car. Well, how about this one out of the Portago fatality that killed a bunch of people? We need that engine. So anyway, in it goes, and Musso won the pole with a big top-heavy car. Anyway, the fastest of the Americans was Paul White with the most seal fresh Curtis. Anyway, we're supposed to be talking about Walt Hanscom. So the race started, and actually Walt Hanscom plays a little bit of a role in this. At the end of the second lap, not the end of the first lap, as often as reported, but at the end of the second lap, there was this terrible accident with Dave McDonald and then ultimately Eddie Sachs and a bunch of other cars were taken out. They were down for an hour and 42 minutes, and then restarted, and then several things happened with people coming from the back to the front, and people coming from the front to the back. And it was on that day that probably Bobby Marshman stamped himself as a major contender, which is another very interesting person, that there seems to be a revival of interest on him. I've been asked about Bobby Marshman quite a bit, like in the last 4 or 5 years, and my answer was he was Rick Mears before you had Rick Mears. But anyway, in the back, Walt Hanston came up through the pack and actually ran third for quite a few laps. It would have been around the time that, let's see, I'm not sure if it would be before or after Hurtubise fell back and then was out, but you had Marshall was the early leader, Clark was an early leader, and then you had Parnelli Jones and Foyt had a great battle for about 6 laps. And then Parnelli had the problem with apparently static electricity caused the fuel tank to blow, and so then Foyt was pretty much cruising from that point on, with Roger Ward in second, having a fuel mixture problem and having to make a lot of stops. But behind all of that, for a while, Hanskin ran third. And he made a lengthy pit stop at some point, and did they change a mag or something? The pit stop it was like maybe a 15-20 minute stop. And I've heard some reports that they thought, well, we're out, and Hanskin said, no, let's keep running. You know, I mean, he knew about enduros, and the people thought that, and we keep going. So he actually was running at the end of the race. He was 13th and quite a few laps behind. And then he went to, and I don't know if I'm being fair with this, but he went to Milwaukee in August because Lotus with Ford, they'd run Indianapolis with Clark and Gurney. They were going to do Milwaukee and the Trenton 200s. And I think originally Hanston was going to be a Lotus driver, and then he crashed in a practice session, and then it ended up that the Lotus drivers were Parnelli Jones and Foyt. But anyway, it's a further tangent there. He came back to Indianapolis in '65, and I think it was 53 again, except this time it was orange, and he didn't have as good a run this time, but he did make the race and dropped out late and got 14th. And then the trivia is that in '66, he was entered in what ended up being the winning car. He was entered in the American Red Bull Special, John Meekum. And when Meekum came, he joined what are now known as Indy cars. He came into the fray at the 150-mile race at Indianapolis Raceway Park with Roger Ward. But the team for '66, boy, there's all kinds of tensions on this one. The team for '66 was going to be Roger Ward, John Surtees, and Walt Hanskin. That was the original team. And then Surtees got hurt. I think it was a Can-Am race in Mosport.
Yes.
And then Jackie Stewart came in as his replacement, even though, and then. So Walt Hanskin was to be in the American Red Bull car, right up to the point where they went to Le Mans for a special test in April, and he aquaplaned, and then I think it was April the 24th. If you get and then Graham Hill gets the car and then goes on to win the race. Surtees' version is that Graham Hill sucked for him and won the race, and that if he hadn't got hurt, then Surtees thought that he would have won the race, not quite. There's other theories here. Roger Ward, Stewart and Hill had a double overhead camshaft Fords. Ward had a supercharged coffee, which he wasn't very happy about, and in fact he even said in the later years of his life, he said, I thought I was the #1 driver on that team, but apparently I wasn't. When I signed up, I won the 500 twice, and these two guys had never driven in it, so I thought I was the senior driver, but Stewart and Hill got all the good stuff. Well, anyway, the point is that Hill came onto the team, I think maybe the first week in May. So if you go to the program, number 24 American Red Bull Special, there is no driver, because they pulled Hanskin, but they didn't have a substitute yet. And what other Hanskin trivia can I give you? There is a car that is normally on display at the Speedway. I don't think it's on the display at the moment. And it's painted up as Jack Brabham's Cooper that finished 1961. It isn't. What is supposedly the real one is out west, but the paint job is wrong. Oh, which reminds me of that the old Hanskin anti-liquid suspension car has been restored. The paint job is not quite right. The blue is quite a bit off, and I know why that is, but here I am telling tales and that red light's on back there. But, yeah, I did lose my way. We've got paint jobs, colors, Hanskin, except I had one before that. Anyway, the Hanskin car as it's restored is a lot darker than it should be. Oh, the Cooper. The Cooper that is portrayed as Brabham's 1961 car that the museum has came from Jim Hall, came from Chaparral Cars. And there is a possibility that it is the car that Brabham drove in the exploratory test in October of '60 to see, you know, do we want to try and run Indianapolis, let's run a test, which Roger Ward set up. And again, more tangents here. Roger Ward was very forward thinking, and when I mentioned about how, you know, you had all these specialists, Roger Ward is famous probably in road racing for driving midgets, but he also drove sports cars in road races as well, and doesn't get enough credit for that, I don't think. And he drove a BRM in the 1973 Grand Prix at Watkins Glen. Did he drive the midget at Sebring? Yes, but he also drove a BRM at the Glen on the old circuit. But anyway, Roger Ward is the one that encouraged Brabham and Cooper to come to the Speedway. Because when he was down at Sebring and realized that he was horribly outclassed with the midget down there, but he was very impressed with Brabham's handling characteristics in the corner. And he went to Brabham and Cooper, and John Cooper was a great guy. I don't know how many people here had an opportunity to know him, but I mean, he was just a wonderful person. And so Ward befriended them. And so rather than being the establishment that said, boo, rear engine cars, foreigners, who needs them, Ward actually made the arrangements for the test, drove the car, and one of his sons told me that Brabham stayed at his house when he came in for the test. But anyway, the reason for, and I'll bring myself back into the fact that the car that is portrayed as Brabham's 9th place finisher, which may be the one that Brabham ran in '60, apparently was the one that Hank Sharp, I'm supposed to be talking about both hands, never mind. But I'll throw it anyway. Hank Sharp drove that in the U.S. Grand Prix. Sorry, I had a little bit of a glitch, and I had Hanskin and Hank Sharp together. All right, yes, sir.
Can I just tell one quick story, very quickly, and that is that relative to your comments about the friendship between Jack Brabham and Roger Ward. Not too many years ago, when they both were alive, I was at the Monterey Historics, and they were both there, and I was pretty amazed. I had met both of them but briefly, but I was just in one part of the area, and all of a sudden the two come together and they're talking animatedly because Roger Ward is saying, Jack, do you have any of those Repco parts? Because I have a chassis and I want to put together one of your Repco cars. They were talking like two enthusiasts as we would under any circumstances. I got a great picture of the two of them talking. They were great friends and obviously two fantastic champions.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I'm big on the people, and when I'm looking at books, I like to read shots. And what I love is you know, beyond the post shots, I love the candid shots where you see the camaraderie between two people. And there's a wonderful shot that IMS has that is evidently after Brabham and Ward had both qualified in '61. And Ward has come by the garage to congratulate Brabham on making the race, evidently. And Brabham, who you know, he was a very serious person most of the time, and he's grinning from ear to ear, and there is a, you know, the equivalent of a helmet bag that is on the bench that is assuming is his travel bag, because he's just qualified and he's on his way because he's going to I think. But anyway, Ward has come by, and just the camaraderie and the joy between the two of them. I love that shot and shots like it. All right, this gentleman had his hand up here for probably about the last 30 minutes, and I wasn't following you up. Yes, sir.
I will avoid the obvious comparison of names, which I'm sure Bill Green in the back here knows what I'm getting at. The fact that Jim Rathman's real name was Richard and Dick Rathman's real name was James. I just wondered if you would be so kind as to comment briefly on a driver who I think is one of the most underrated drivers ever to run the 500, Mel Kenyon.
Okay, absolutely. Let me touch on the Rathman thing. And this is something that I think probably a few of us have experienced in certain age. I have been blessed, as I said a while ago, to come to know these people. And a lot of stories that you've read or, you know, tend to accept as gospel. And when you talk to the people, you know, some have an extra grind, and then others, you know, when you first hear a story from somebody, you think, oh, that guy's just crying in his beer and trying to justify it. And then when you talk to more people, sometimes you find out that a lot of what, you know, other people have said that were not popularly known turned out to be true. And then, I don't know if any of that makes sense, but you learn about the people, and you learn about the families, and you learn about, when you have an opportunity like to go give a talk and go on a trip with somebody, and then you start learning the really personal stuff. And then you don't know what to do with it. And I mean, I've learned so many things that I found out that I thought, God, I'd love to run with this, but I don't think it's fair to the person. And one of them is the Rathman name. Now, the easy version is that Jim was actually Richard, as you said, and Richard was James. And when Jim, as we know him, wanted to start racing, he was 16 years old, and you either had to be 21 or 18, but you sure couldn't do it legally at 16. And so what he did was to borrow his brother's ID. And so they basically swapped names, because a little bit later than Dick, as we know him, who's really James, he decided to race as well. And so the 1960 winner, Jim Rathman, was actually Richard, and Dick Rathman, the 1958 pole winner, is really James. Well, the true name of Jim Rathman, once in a while you would see, there was a speed age story that gave his name as Richard R. Rathman. And one time he told me, he said, my name is actually Royal, R-O-Y-A-L. He said, I am Royal Richard Rathman. I said, really? And he said, yeah. But he said, but I'm Jim to everybody. But he said, my driver's license says Richard. And so anyway, I knew that for several years, but I didn't do anything with it. And then when he passed away, I asked the family, I said, now that he's deceased, what do you think? And they said, yes, that was his name. Go with it. So we revealed that at that time, right? And I do have another one like that, and I didn't ask for permission on this one, but the daughter of Freddie Aggravation, and Fred Aggravation is a very important person in my life, by the way. I owe him a huge deal of gratitude. When I'm doing my thanks to everybody, Fred Aggravation is right near the top. And I asked the daughter one time, I said, his middle initial was L. I've seen occasionally enlisted as Fred L. Aggravation. She said his name was Levon, L-E-V-O-N, which is an Armenian name. And she said his name wasn't Fred at all. She that up. His name was Levon Aggravation, and Fred was a name that he gave himself. And And then another one too was that we've read about George Francis Patrick Flaherty. His name was actually George Francis Flaherty Jr. And Pat was a long-time nickname. Patrick was not in his name. And his wife had told me, I knew him a little bit, but after he was deceased, his wife told me, she said, I was from Chicago, and he came back, and I moved to Buenos Aires, and then she said, when I first went back to California to meet the family, and she said, I kept hearing them talk about George, and she says, who's George? And he said, well, that's me. And, the older Flaherty's called him George. Because that was his real name. And there's another one. An East Coast driver from Haddonfield, New Jersey, named Mike McGill. Anybody remember Mike McGill? There's a few of them. All right. His name is Charles Edward McGill. Mike was a nickname. No Michael. So, anyway, sorry. What the hell did you want me to talk about? Mel Kenyon. Oh, yeah, right. All right. Mel Kenyon was, I think, without question, probably the best, if not the greatest midget car driver of all time, then I think certainly since post-World War II, because Bob Swanson gets a lot of votes. But I think unquestionably with Mel Kenyon's accomplishments is absolutely phenomenal. He won the USAC National Championship 7 times, and the total number of victories I think ended up being 111 national victories. But he actually had more seconds than he had first. And I'm just talking USAC National Championship. I'm not talking regionals or other associations. So how many total races did Mel Kenyon win? I have no idea. There's 111 documented USAC national wins. And then I think if you take the first, seconds, and thirds, they don't call them podiums in midget racing, but the total number of first, seconds, and thirds, I think you're probably talking about 450. And he did a lot of his own mechanical work with his brother Don. And I'll jump to the Speedway because he was actually at the track in 1965 with a Roadster, which qualified and got bumped. And then it was a month after that he went to Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and then had this accident. There was a 4-car accident, and he was basically, momentarily stunned or knocked out. And there was methanol fire. And so it's the thing with the methanol fire is that you couldn't see it unless it got really hot. And I'm sure that I've had a close-up and personal look at a methanol fire a couple of times. I'm sure that some of you have, maybe many of you. And the best way I would describe it, it's like a heat haze, a shimmering heat haze. You can't see the flame, you just see this ripple with the distortion in the color behind it. And then if it turns orange or yellow, then it's time to maybe find another place to go. But anyway, so this fire started, and this rather gently, but it's started. And by the time they got in there and got Kenyon out, his hands, the one hand was burning and on the face and everything. So it was, Curtibees had already been to the San Antonio Burn Center and back out again. And so that's where they took Kenyon for 3 months. And his situation was a little bit different because rather than make a decision about how do you want your fingers set, which is what they did with Curtibees, it ended up that they did 2 or 3 operations and that he ended up with no fingers on the left hand at all. He just had a palm. And so he was already devising a way to come back and go racing. And with his brother, Don, and his father, they devised this glove that would slide on to the left hand and then be tied so that the thing wouldn't fall off. And in the palm of where the palm was, there would be a rubber grommet. And on the steering wheel, there would be a stud. And so what he would do is to grab the hand, with the right hand, and then the left hand, you would basically be steering with the palm. And so this worked out very well with widgets. In fact, he said, you know, I've even got an advantage here, because if I get in a tight spot, I can do a 360. I just take the right hand off and I can do one of these if I need to move in a hurry. And my colleagues can't do that. So then he came to the Speedway and he was out for the rest of the summer, made to come back in '66 in the spring with midgets. And I don't remember when he had the first win, but I mean, he was making the trophy dash right off the bat and finishing third and fourth and running. So there was the concern about coming to the Speedway and that would he be able to pass the physical. So there was some discussion, but several people went to bat for him, and then they decided, okay, well, you know, we'll give you a temporary or probation. We'll take a look and see how you do. Well, the '66 race, he just kept running all day, and there was a huge attrition, and he ended up fifth. And then in '67, he got taken out late by Cale Yarborough. Back in the days when we had a really interesting mix of drivers. I mean, we didn't have people that were out of place. We had the best of the best when they were at the top of their game. So here's Cale Yarborough and Leroy Yarborough at the Speedway. But anyway, it was Cale who took out Mel, and Mel wasn't very happy about that. But then, and I'll give you the finishes and then go back and tell you the story. He got a third in 1968. It's a pretty big company. Bobby Youngster won it, Journey was second, Mel Kenyon was third, and Dennis Holm was fourth, Lloyd Ruby's fifth. There's an anecdote there. I'll come back and do it and try and believe it on. In '69 he was fourth, and Mario won it, Journey was second, Bobby Youngster was third, and Mel was fourth, with Peter Revson behind him, although Revson in a distant with a red bird that was down the cylinder, and then some major names behind him, but admittedly they all had mechanical problems. But Kenyon's was a very, very steady driver. And then he had one more fourth, and that was in the rain in '73. But I want to go back and do '68. So he's been out of he was injured in June of '65, and now we're talking the winter of '67, '68. And he'd driven for Fred Gerhardt in the '67 race with Thermo King sponsorship. And Fred Gerhardt tells Don and Mel in the spring, he actually took it upon himself to try and raise the money. Now, they were trying to get $15,000, and I don't think they got close to that, but they did have a bunch of local businessmen and friends, and people gave them $100, and somebody would give them $2,000, and they raised enough money, and they ran the cars to City of Lebanon, Indiana especially. But here's the point, and when you hear about commitment, how about this? Don Kenyon was the chief mechanic, and he was the only paid person on the team, and I think he got $150 a week. Mel Kenyon was his own engine man. Now, he only had his fingers on one hand, and he wasn't born like this. He's adjusted to this in the last couple of years. And so they had one off the engine, a turbocharged Dolby, when that was a fairly new engine, and they had a crew, which were midget drivers and friends, midget car drivers, I should say, to distinguish. How many people have heard this story or even been involved in this one yourself, where they said that when I was first courting my wife, or I had this girlfriend, and I said, where are we going to go for a date? Let's go to the midget races, and the lady would say, what? That's preposterous. Midgets racing? No, midget cars. Oh. So I've heard that one a lot. But anyway, so Mel was he was in charge of the engine, and they didn't have engine lease programs in those days. When you had an engine, it was yours, and you tore it down and put it back together. And he was the only person that worked on the engine, and then also he had agreed to drive for 40% of the prize money. What was Mel Kenyon's retainer? 0. He was the driver, and the engine man, Nigel Mansell, and his guarantee was 0. If they missed the show, he would have got nothing. Michael Schumacher. So, anyway, they made the show, and cars dropped out, and they ended up finishing third. But I think that is absolutely extraordinary. Mayor Bob Campbell, once again, was the refueler, and Mel, they finished third, so the prize money was substantial, so he got 40% of that, but he went into it with no guarantee at all. There is a little tangent off of this that will involve several names that you're familiar with, and that is the fact that late in the race, Kenyon was running fourth, and third was Dennis Holmes. And well, Lennon dropped out with the turbine, so then actually would have been a position further back than that. Anyway, the point is that late in the race, it was Bobby Unser was leading, Dan Gurney was second with the stop block. Dennis Holm was third with the turbo Ford, and then Mel. Dennis Holm came in and made a stop because he had a tire going down, and the jack didn't work. Now this is going to sound like a made-up story, but I saw it myself. It was a lengthy stop, and it allowed Kenyon to go to third, and Holm ended up fourth. But on the last stop for Holm, and I think it was like maybe lap 194 or something like that, the jack didn't work. Gordon Johncock was out of the race and dressed in civvies, and Hoyt was out of the race and dressed in civvies, and they were standing there watching this. They jumped over the wall, and with a couple of other crew members, they lifted the rear of the car up. Here's A.J. Foyt, the defending winner of the race, and last year's 24 Hours of Le Mans winner, and he's lifting the thing up by the axle so that they could change the tire. It was a Goodyear car. If it was Firestone, they wouldn't have been. Yeah. I'm here to tell you, John Cock and Foyt helped lift the rear end up so that they could get that wheel changed and then home and off and finish fourth. But anyway, supposed to be talking about Kenyon. His speedway days were pretty much over by 76 was the last time, or 77 rather was the last time he made a qualifying attempt. But he continued running midgets until about 6 or 7 years ago. And then he finally retired. But I mean, he's just the nicest person that you could possibly meet. And very, very religious, but he doesn't force it on you, and just a very fine person. Let me just throw this one out too. And I know I've been talking a lot, but I haven't even got close to what we said at that time would have been. So, and I know it's a little hot in here, so maybe, I don't know if, I'm happy to keep going here, but I'm not done quite yet. No.
Let's stop now.
Yes.
Let's go to about 3:30.
Okay then, very good. He suggested we go to 3:30, and so we got about 10 minutes to go here, but I wanted to throw this out. From the time that I first showed up at the track, I had met a few drivers. I had met Jim Clark, and I'd met Bob Gerard, and I'd met Les Leston, to stir everything up in the past. But when I came to Indianapolis, and I thought I knew quite a bit about it, but probably the biggest surprise that I had was how friendly and down to earth the drivers were. I was amazed. I thought that Indianapolis 500 drivers would be very intense. You know, just looking at the photograph and considering what they did, I thought they would be very, very intense people. I thought they would have handlers. I thought they would have an entourage, and they didn't. Almost everybody was friendly. Notice that I said almost everybody. A couple had a little bit of an edge, but for the most part, they were extremely nice people, and they just were, you know, Len Sutton, Bob Christie, Chuck Stevenson, Bobby Marshman. They were the night, Parnelli Jones, Clark. They were all really nice people. And even some of the ones that I thought would be tough guys, and So then, as I had a chance to sort of then come back and work for USAC and be around them, and then get into other areas, Richard Petty is a really nice guy. David Pearson is a really nice guy. And a lot of the Grand Prix drivers, and I have to say that I have no idea how many drivers that I've met, whether they were Sprint, Formula One, NASCAR, FCCA. I'd say just about every driver that I've ever met and sat and talked with one-on-one is a nice person. I mean, that's a constant. And like, I remember Hans-Harold Frentzen, delightful, just a really sweet person. Michele Alboreto. Anybody meet Alboreto? A lovely bloke. I mean, I'm thinking others like, Alessandro Zampagri, but I thought he was Michele Alboreto, and I think he drove for Ferrari for 5 years. Nicest, sweetest guy that you could meet. Barrichello, this year. Barrichello, a very, very nice guy. And Jean Olise. In fact, let me throw this on Olise. They have, they had a hard time this year. And I don't know, I was kind of sorry about a couple of things that happened, but anyway, regardless, he squeezes into the field. He's the slowest qualifier. And so the American Dairy Association had a lunch for the fastest rookie qualifier. Well, maybe that wouldn't be too terribly appealing to some of the names that I've mentioned in the past, and some of the ones that I didn't. I mean, that's probably pretty lowly. But every rookie was there. And here's Jean Olise. Not only is he not the fastest rookie, he's the slowest person in the field. He could have blown this off. He came to the lunch. And he sat with some milk people. He had somebody with him that I think was sort of like an aide or a handler of some kind. But he didn't know anybody else at the table, myself included, because they sat near the table. And I thought, oh, thank you, God. Thank you. So anyway, he shook hands with the people on either side of him. He got up and went around to shake hands with everybody and exchanged pleasantries. And I'm sure he was a little ill at ease because he didn't know anybody, and they were race fans, but didn't, couldn't really talk his kind of language. And then at the end of the thing, they do a toast of milk. There's bottles of milk on every table, and then everybody, salutes. So he filled with his glass, and he clinked on either side, and then he did something I've never seen anybody else do before. He got up and then clinked everybody else at the table. And I thought, what a prince. And then on the night before the race, they had the last row party, and he went to that. I mean, he went to some other functions as well, so he didn't stay very long. But anyway, I thought he was an absolute prince, and the crew guys, some of them were, Indianapolis born and raised, said what a really nice guy he was. And then Barrichello, that was a real treat, because everything that I had gathered about him, from the time he first came on the scene, and whenever he won his first Grand Prix, which I think, was it in Brazil? Was his first Grand Prix, and he was just totally euphoric and pouring the champagne on his head and everything like that. And he was young. I mean, wasn't he like 21 or 22, I think, when he first came on the scene? I'm a little hazy on that. So anyway, here's all these years later, and so he finally came to the track, and he had his wife and his kids with him. And I had an opportunity to meet with him, and I said, did you ever have a chance to come over to the museum when you were running that one? And he said, no. And I said, well, if you'd like to come over, there's something that I think you would enjoy seeing. And I don't know that I told him what it was, but it was a Stewart that he ran in '98. And it was in an area where we don't normally take people, which would have, congratulations to the people who bringing it up. But so he came over with the wife and the kids, and we went into this area, which has a lot of vehicles, and he immediately said, oh, there it is over there. And it was way on the other side of the road. And we went over, and it was really neat to watch him look at the car, and and just, oh yeah, remember that, remember this. And it was just sort of like he was just reviewing an acquaintance with an old friend. And that was just a delight. But I guess I didn't need to tell you that story necessarily, but just over the years, so many of them that I've met that just were extremely nice people. And, you know, I never really guessed Franson. I really didn't know anything about him. But, all right, yes, sir.
Given the extraordinary history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway 500 over the past 100 years with the automobile, the driver, the mechanics, the fans, where are we going in the future? What do you think the next 100 years are going to be? If you had a crystal ball, where do you think it's going?
I have no idea, and it just bothers me to think about it, really. I mean, I mean, I'm concerned about motor racing in general. I'm not just Indianapolis Motor Speedway, I'm motor racing. And I really don't know how to answer the question, but I mean, I've been sort of feeling that for many, many years. And so my answer would be, I just happily live in the past. I like front-engine cars, black and white photographs. I like doing research, and just a few comments on that, because a number of you have done research, and I think probably most of you, if you've done research, you've done real research. When I have people say, well, I tried to research so-and-so and so-and-so, well, what they did was they sat at the computer and Googled, you know. Listen, unless you've been on your hands and knees going through boxes and getting dirty, you ain't done research. Did you travel to another town to read microfilm? You know, were you on your hands and knees? No, that ain't research. So anyway, so I would just say, and not being in your head, there's been many a time, you know, decades ago when I was very concerned about what was going on in the future of motorsport. And I would just as soon not think about it, so I can't really give you, that's a terrible answer, I'm sorry, but...
Maybe one follow-up then. Within the past 10, maybe 20 years, who do you think are the present-day drivers who 50, 100 years from now are going to be remembered like we remember Wilbur Shaw, A.J. Floyd, and those people?
That's a toughie, because I don't know that there's really anybody, and I don't know why that would be, but we have all these larger-than-life characters. You know, Vukovic is about as iconic as anybody that ever ran at the Speedway. Very little is known about him because he was a very private person, and maybe that's what helped the mystery. You know, I mean, he came in, he only ran 5 times, you know, and then that's another thing too. You know, Parnelli Jones, he only ran to 500 7 times. And Clark, 5, you know, not that Clark's whole career is Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but you know, as far as somebody like Vukovic, he said he just came in and was only there for a very, very short time. There was mystery about him. He came from very meager beginnings. And he wouldn't talk to the press. I mean, he had his friends, but he was very reluctant to be around people that he didn't know. He just didn't really have great social voices. But then, you didn't have to. All you had to do was be able to drive a race car. That's all the car owners cared about. And so I think that and then there was something about the name, you know, the Mad Russian. He wasn't Russian. He was Yugoslavian, but of Yugoslavian descent. But at the time, in the early 50s, he had this sort of Russian name, and sort of there was maybe a little bit of, you know, I've had people say that, you know, I was a kid, and Vukovic was sort of like a frightening name, you know. So I think that you had all these things going. If Vukovic was around now, which he could be, but there's another thing too about the way things are now and the way that they were. The general comment here, and I don't know if this is the kind of thing that you want to hear, but when I grew up, I just never thought about how Grand Prix drivers got to be where they were, you know. And then after I got over here, and then I understood fully that a lot of the American people came from very meager beginnings, and that in the rest of the world, that was not so. And so the way that it is in the United States now, because you hear it's all about money and the drivers have to be from wealthy families or have to be able to get money. Well, in the rest of the world, that's how it was all the time. You know, most of the Brits, Italians, Brazilians, they came from money families, virtually all of them. And so the thing is, if you look back now, most of the great American drivers, or many of the great American drivers, could never have been if it had been in the United States the way it was, and it was that way in the United States before World War I. You know, when you have the Spencer Wishards and the David Bruce Browns and the people like that could afford to do it. Even Tommy Milton came from a money family. I don't know that that's so well known, but you would never have had Cornelius Jones. You never would have had Foyt. You wouldn't have had the Unsers and Mario and on and on and on. You know, it's highly unlikely that any of those people would have made it. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but so is there anybody now that will be remembered?
I guess their history has not been completed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you know, Frank Keating has now won the Indianapolis 500 3 times, and Weldon won it twice. But Frank Keating's a great guy. He's a really good person with a very strong sense of history. Not only is Clark his hero, but it's beyond that. If there's going to be a racing swap meet, Frank Keating asks if he can go in ahead of time and see the stuff. Great. And another thing too, just about Frank Keating, that I think some of you might enjoy. He's been over to the museum several times, you know, to see Clark's stuff. And he drove the '65 winner. Let me tell you a quick story about that. In 2010 is when Frank Keating drove the Lotus for Road and Track. Well, that goes back a little bit, and when he knew that opportunity was coming up, he decided that he wanted to wear a uniform. If he couldn't find Clark's uniform, and he still loved Clark memorabilia, he wanted to get a uniform that replicated Clark's. So we got him some photographs, and he found out that Hinchman Uniforms was still in business and still making uniforms, and he contacted them, and they said, yes, we've got the patterns. And so they made him a uniform. The Lotus patch that you see on that uniform, I did assert myself a little bit, is actually one I loaned him off of a Lotus mechanics uniform. But anyway, the thing is that when they were going to do this, they had, I think, Tuesday and Wednesday locked out in September of 10, I don't know the dates, but it was right after the race in Japan. So everybody goes to Motegi, Japan. They come back. God knows what that flight's like. I've never done that one. But anyway, they got back, and he arrived in Indianapolis on Monday at 1 o'clock. He went straight down to Hitchcock's to try on the uniform to see if it fit. So the guy is just a pure enthusiast. And then the other thing, too, is that he came over to the museum one day with Dixon. And I think this was last year. And the museum hadn't closed yet. It was kind of late in the day, so there was a few people around. And he comes over and he's wearing jeans, hat pulled down over his head, and I don't know if anybody really recognized him. So they both came in pretty much incognito, and they were looking at the various cars. The 1980 winner is the Johnny Rutherford Jim Hall Chaparral, which is designed by John Barnard, although none of the press kits ever mentioned John Barnard's name, but that's another story. Barnard's design. It's the first car that had ground effects incorporated into its design. So here's Frank Keating and Dixon looking at the cars. Frank Keating steps over the roof, and he goes behind the Jim Hall car, and he laid down on the ground to look underneath it. And I thought, not only did he mind, getting himself dirty, not the floors on particularly slapped every day, but the very fact that he would get down to look underneath the car, the very fact that he would even know that there was something under there that you know, might be interesting to have a look at. So I've got all the regard in the world for him. But you know, in years to come, how will Kirsten Evers, you know, Frank Heedy, Dixon, you know, Kanan, I don't know how they will be remembered. What we're looking at now, and Michael's up here, so I'll bring this thing up to hopefully a happy conclusion. But you're now looking at the fact that next year you've got two guys that have very little chance of becoming a four-time winner. Because Frank Heedy and Kirsten Evers, in fact, it kind of surprised. I mean, a couple of years ago, I thought Kirsten Evers was the shoe-in winner, and it didn't work out. So pretty soon, Foyt and Al Unser and Rick Mears are going to have one or two more joining them. But let me wind up by saying that I was supposed to be talking about Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and I'll wind up by doing that last year was the 100th anniversary of the first running. It wasn't the 100th running. That would be in 2016, but it was the 100th anniversary. So several years out, there was discussion, what can we do to make this special? And so I had a little bit of an involvement, but I wasn't a decision maker. I mean, I wasn't on any committee other than on an unofficial basis. And so I said, can we please do something to honor the drivers? And what I really wanted to do, and I don't know where I first got the idea, but Watkins Glen was doing it 50 years ago, and that is, well, actually they do it with the current field to send, you know, they were sending the drivers out. I said, can we do something with the former winners, at least? Could we put the winners out on the track in one of several ways? At the very least, can we put them in pace cars? And I don't mean 5 guys stuffed in one car, but a pace car goes out and there's one guy. If there's other people in it, the family, that's fine. The winner, the guy sitting up on the back, won the Indianapolis 500. Could we please do that? And then beyond that, why don't we put out a blanket invitation? Because the place has always been so welcoming to the former participants. And I think I mentioned that probably 3 hours ago about the fact that they would come back, some of them would spend the whole month. It was just this big reunion every year. And, you know, if you ran once, you know, 35 years ago, you're welcome. And so I said, obviously, you know, you can't pay everybody's way, but could we at least extend the invitation? So the word went out early, and the intent was, let's get as many Indianapolis 500 drivers as we possibly can, and maybe we could have a group photo. And so it worked out very well. At the time we tried to do it, we first talked about it, there were 270 living Indianapolis 500 drivers. By the time it came to pass, 2 had passed away, so it was 268 living, plus 5 rookies for the 2011 race. On the morning before the race, they do a 1-hour autograph session, which they've done for several years, and I can't believe this is so successful every year, but from 9 to 10, the morning before the race, they have all 33 drivers, and I think for like 5, 6, 7 years in a row now, they've never had a no-show. So they did that, plus they had some winners, and then at 11 o'clock there was going to be the drivers' meeting, and so we had a window between 10 and 10:30, so it would be approximately 10:15, 10:30 to do a group shot. And we ended up, we had 161 drivers in the shop who had driven in the Indianapolis 500, or at least 156 plus 5 that we're going to tomorrow. And then we had some family members at the end. But from the end on down, there was no interlopers, there was no guests, nobody snuck in. Everybody in the shop was a winner, or was a competitor. And about the only choreography, I guess you could say, was that a fellow named Steve Shunt, they set up some temporary bleachers, believe it or not, with a row of chairs in front, and we had the 3 full-time winners, and then the 3-time winners, the 2-time winners, and the 1-time winners going out. So you got 20 guys in a row that won the 500. And in fact, the only Danny Sullivan had been there and had to leave because he was going to do something in connection with Monaco, I believe. Eddie Cheever was the only 500 winner on the grounds that wasn't in the photograph, and that was because ABC was doing a rehearsal, and they wouldn't let Goodyear and Cheever come down. Boo! Anyway, so we had 20 winners, and then the mix of people in there was just unbelievable. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. 5 more minutes? Sure. Okay. And so it was interesting the people that showed up, and it was also interesting the people that didn't show up. Dick Simon wasn't there. I thought Jose Garza would be there. He wasn't there. Vern Schupan came from Australia, and we had Gurney, and then the surprises were we had Hector Rabaki showed up, Bill Whittington showed up, and then Don Whittington got there too late for the picture. I never would have guessed that Whittington would show up, but I'm not going there. So anyway, we had everybody, and time was of the essence. And then Steve Shump said to me, this is one of the most unbelievable experiences of my life. He said, look, do you think we should do one more quick sweep to make sure that we don't have any interlopers? And so I checked with Ron McQueen. He said, yeah, we got to come. He said, I said, all right, okay, I'll just have a quick run. So I kind of got down and did a sideways trot, looking up into the bleachers, and I'm looking at all these faces. There were some of the current guys I have never met, and ladies I have never met. But I probably knew at least casually 150 of the 161, and probably knew 125 or more quite well. And that was just awesome, and I don't use that term very often. But we had Paul Goldsmith, and we had Art Malone, and we had Donnie Allison, and Schupan, as I said, and Dan Gurney, and Rapake, and on and on. It was just unbelievable. And then we did an autograph session that afternoon. Bobby Johns. Oh, Townsend Bell wanted to meet Joe Leonard because he drove the wedge turbine. Townsend Bell was fascinated by the wedge turbines, and that's before he was born. Frank Heaney wanted to meet Bobby Johns because he was Jim Clark's teammate in 65, which was another great story on how that came to be, and how totally wrong on I thought it was politics that got Bobby Johns. I thought, Bobby Johns is going to drive the second Lotus. What? I was astounded at that assignment, and then when I found out what I know, it's a really neat story, but I don't think we've got time to go there. But anyway, the next morning, then we did a shot with pole winners, and that was so hard to pull together. We actually had 12 pole winners posed with each other on the night of the first qualifying day. So race morning, we had these pace cars lined up. Yes, I got my wish. One pace car per driver, and they had all these pace cars lined up just in case. We didn't know. Maybe Sam Hornish Jr. may show up, or maybe Jacques Villeneuve will show up. Nah. So anyway, but we had a car for everybody plus a couple. And the way things were going that morning, I thought, boy, it's unraveling here. You know, Foyt's got a team, Railroad's got a team. All these people have got their other obligations. I think we're probably, you know, if we get 7 or 8, it'll be pretty darn good. We had 15. The only living winner on the grounds that didn't ride in the car was Eddie Cheever because ABC was letting them down. But we had everybody else, and they spaced the cars. And somebody just this weekend was telling me what a great job they did instead of packing them up. I would like to see the cars a little closer together, but they had probably 100 yards between each car. It was got one pop on the PA. There was no names on the side of the car, but I'm telling you, the ovation from the crowd as the cars went around, because here comes Foyt, here comes Mario, here comes Bobby Unser, Al Unser, Fittipaldi, you know, and all of these winners. It was just unbelievable. Parnelli Jones, if I didn't mention him, Rutherford, and then following that, After they all came in, then we had 10 Indianapolis winning cars with iconic drivers. And the only two people that got to drive their own was Lion Dyker was an 80 winner, and Rutherford drove the 80 winner. And then the others drove, like Mario drove the Maserati, the Roadster Maserati. And I have a special moment for that, which I'm going to sneak in if I can here. Let's see, well, Kenny Bragg, well, rather than do the whole lineup, Al Unser, Sr. drove the Jim Clark winner. And somebody, I was actually there when he was sitting in the thing, and somebody came up and said, Jim Clark was your teammate, wasn't he, in 66? He said, no, I was Jim Clark's teammate. So anyway, when they fired those up and went out, and you know how vintage cars are now, you have to have roll bars, and the drivers have to wear the helmets and all this stuff. That was waiting. And so every one of those guys went out bareheaded. Thank you, God, thank you. And I hope nobody's offended by the fact that I said that, but to just see Rutherford go out, and Al, and just, you know, the clenching of the mouth as they're putting it in gear, and oh my God, I get goosebumps just thinking about it, and there were 10 of them now. And there was a last minute switch, okay, so Sneva was supposed to drive the St. Hanks Milan car. Al Unser Jr. was in the Maury Rose Blue Ground front row. And Sneva, this is about 5 minutes before they went back, and Sneva said, I got a problem here, can we get the seat back? No. He said, I can't do the clutch. My heel, my leg's too long. And he said, whoever drove this, I said, well, it was St. Hanks, it was a 6-footer. Well, if the car ran as like a 63, and they evidently had a shorter driver, and still set up a shorter driver. So anyway, so Sneva gets out, and Al Jr. says, well, let me try it. So we're playing musical drivers. Al Jr. gets in, and he said, nope, I can't do it either. We need a shorter driver. Mario. So I run down, and this just occurred to me, you know what? Mario came to the 1958 race. This is the kind of thing that you normally think about when you're driving home later that day, but it came to be right at the moment. Mario and his brother Aldo and their uncle came to the 500 in 1958. I don't know if you knew that. They came as teenagers. They'd only been in the country 3 years. And they actually walked out onto the track after the race was over. But Jimmy Bryan won the race with the Milan. And I went over to Mario and I said, how would you like to drive the car that won the race that you first attended when you were 18? This is a special moment for me, and I'm the only person that saw it. World champion, worldwide experience, courted by royalty, Mario Andretti. He looked like a little boy, and he said, no, I want to drive this. He's a Maserati. She was a little grin. I mean, he was just like a little kid. I mean, he was grabbing on the wheels. So that's one of my all-time great moments. So anyway, all right. Well, who's the second shortest guy? That's Kenny Bragg. All right. So he was in the Montoya winner. We got him out. Al Jr. got in the Ganassi car. Brett got in the Milan and said, yes, I can do it. So anyway, then this year, to my delight and surprise, I heard they're going to do the pace car thing again. And I thought, really? Not the Kardashians? We're going to do one of them? So anyway, forgive me on that one, but anyway, so this year I thought, well, you're not going to have as many come back. And so it ended up, to my surprise, we had 12, including John Cobb, who didn't come last year. But anyway, it's just been very, very special, and the fact that history seems so important, and the fact that I've made a career out of just living my dream by loving history and sharing it. And here we are in this room, and all of you are still kind kind enough to be sitting here, you're either too polite to leave, or at least you maybe were But we probably should wind up here, but I want to thank Michael for inviting me to do this. I started out quite some time ago talking about coming up here. I can't tell you what a thrill it was to be part of this. I mean, to come to the Glen, have those experiences in 73, 73, 74, and then drive around today and then see how little has changed. But, the Glen Motor Court, the name subtle change, but it's still there. I actually pulled into the parking lot and just sat there and just reminisced a little bit. And I went by, the Jefferson is gone, but the motel units are out in the back still. And they were green doors and now they're brown. But I actually sat there on both sides of the road and just nostalgia, which is the name I made up. When we're done here, I hope that was halfway kind of the stuff that you wanted to hear about. When we're done, I ain't done. I need a drink of water, and then we can carry on in a more informal basis when we're going to adjourn to the ribbon, and I'll keep going as long as you want to go. If you had your hand in the air and I didn't get to you, I apologize. But anyway, thank you very much indeed.
I don't think any of us could ever get enough of Donald Davidson. And what we've witnessed today is the reason Indianapolis 500 remains the greatest race in the world, as it does, is because it has such a wonderful spokesman. Let's give one more round of applause.